2020. Tonight we have actually one tabled matter that requested to table once again to the June 23rd meeting, and we have 4 scheduled items. We have proof of legal publication in the Webster Herald, and before we get started, if we could all just rise and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, Catherine, you want to take a roll, please? Here. Here.
Here.
Here. Here. Here. Okay. As you can see, we're socially distanced, so it's really important that we speak to our microphones tonight, all right? More important than usual, even. Okay. Corinne, would you like to read the first item into the record?
Do we need to make a motion for the tabled matter?
Yeah. The applicant has requested the table, so all in favor that we table that application until June 23rd?
And that's the 478 Ridge Road.
That'd be 478 Ridge Road garage variance for setback. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Okay. The first scheduled matter is 282 Gallant Fox Lane Shed. Located at 282 Gallant Fox Lane, applicants Benjamin and Nicole Halleck are requesting area variances to allow a 5-foot side setback where 15 feet is required and a 5-foot rear setback where 15 feet is required for the construction of a 16 by 10-foot shed on a 0.4 acre parcel having SBL number 050.01-7-5 located in an R2 single-family residential district under section 225-48 of the Code of the Town of Webster. Good evening.
Okay, and we have with us tonight Benjamin?
Yes.
Okay, Benjamin Halleck. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your project?
We already have the shed made for us. We're just basically looking for a little bit more room in our backyard. So with the likelihood of us, when we have kids, but likelihood of us doing more projects in the future, we'd like to have a little more space by pushing it back left to have the front of our yard to be a little more open. There's an easement between our property and the property immediately adjacent to us, looking at the house to the left where we're going to put the shed. So that gives more room between them. And we sent letters to all the adjacent neighbors. 2 lots aren't filled yet. 1 lot has a house, but there's nobody living in it currently.
Now, I visited the site, and I don't see any features that would dictate that it has to go that far back. It's pretty flat. A lot of times people have a septic system in the way and they have to push it back.
Correct.
Or they have a pool in the way, or they have a deck, but right now your backyard's a blank slate.
Correct. So we just want more room.
Well,
And it's forever wild behind us, and I haven't heard any complaints from the neighbors.
typically, we're looking for a reason why you can't comply. We've given several variances like this in a subdivision off of Phillips Road. The yards are tiny. They're 140 feet deep, 60 feet wide, and they need that room literally to use their backyard. But in this case, the yard is 200 feet deep, which is standard depth, and it's a typical half-acre lot.
I would agree with you, Barry. Really, there's, just because I want more room, really is not a hardship.
Yeah, yeah.
When we mapped it out, it ended up being more towards the middle of our lot.
Well, again, the lot has plenty plenty of depth. I don't think the depth is an issue. The rear is a little bit narrow, it's 71 feet at the rear. But the depth, you have quite a bit of yard space. To Don's point, typically, in order to get a variance for this type of item like a shed, there has to be a compelling reason for us to say, well, okay, yeah, he needs that space. You follow the logic?
I do. I mean, based on everything that we saw, it seemed like there needs to be a reason to not do it, not a reason to do it. So when I'm looking at the essential character and no other remedy, I didn't see anything in there that made us say that we couldn't put it back farther. So I'm just based on what we saw when we were going through it. That's why we wouldn't have wasted your time if it was that strict of a code. From what we saw, we didn't see anything that said, no, that's a ridiculous reason to do that.
That's why we have a town code. In other words, the code, technically the shed's supposed to be 15 and 15. And in your zoning, your house has to be 15 feet from the sidelines, and it is. So the code wants that shed to be over so it lines up with the house. And in some cases, people can't do that for a practical reason. Like, say there's the yard's a steep slope, but there's only one flat spot to put it. Well, we'll consider that. But in this case, there's no compelling reason to grant the variance. Anybody else have, am I saying this correctly?
Well, yeah, actually, unlike one of the other cases, this is completely wide open at this point. While I could see that there might be some rear relief possible because you've just got a swale behind the yard, so that's never going to be impacted. Getting it out of the side yard is reasonable within the code, and that's why, for instance, no other remedy. I mean, that's literally getting to where Mr. Barone is saying you don't have anything that's forcing you to do this that requires a variation of the code. It's simply that there are other remedies, and one of them is to meet the code, and it's really not going to be on that size lot. It's not a big hardship as defined by the code. So that's where you run into the problem. You have to come to us and say, I can't do this, and these are the reasons why. I can't meet the code, and these are the reasons why. It's flipped around. You've actually got the burden of proof in this instance, and to Mr. Barone's point, you really don't have it.
In other words, there has to be a hardship for us to grant a variance.
I see that.
Otherwise, the code has no meaning. You know, in other words, if somebody says, I want to just do this, well, the code's in place for a purpose. So,
I was torn. The lot is fairly deep, but it is a somewhat narrow backyard. The side setback of the houses is 15 feet in that area, so ideally what we would try and do is make sure that the sheds are behind the house so that they're not visible from the road. I was less inclined to worry about the rear setback just because it's open space back there. But typically we're granting variances because either the leach lines are there or there's trees or it's a wet spot or whatever, so that's the only reason that there has to be a reason why it can't be at the 15 and 15. And because the house setback is 15, you know, unless there were trees or rocks or some feature that would not prevent it or not permit it to be not the 15-foot side setback. I just, you know, it's not what you want to hear. And I get it. You want to be able to put a swing set in a pool and.
One of my favorite lines that I can't take credit for. One of the attorneys to the zoning board, tell us why you can't comply. And there has to be a reason.
Would
Okay?
we be able to put it back farther but not in farther,
Well,
based on what Ms. Volo said?
are you saying 15 feet from the side, but 5 feet
But
from the
5
rear?
feet from the rear? And that,
I think the board would entertain that. I don't, do you have any opinion about it?
I'm listening to what everybody's saying, and I agree with everything to this point. I mean, we've granted variances for sheds in the past for less than the 15-foot side setback and less than the 15-foot rear setback. I understand the circumstances, but I'm listening to you also. I'm listening for you to actually help yourself and say why you can't comply with the zoning requirements, and at this point you haven't done that at all. Yeah, and if there was a grading issue, if it impacted anything else, and there was a reason why you couldn't do it, then I would say, we've done this before, but you haven't. So we don't use the term forever wild. What do we use for
parkland.
parkland? So I'm not speaking for myself. I'm not opposed to the various requests that you've asked for the rear setback, but I don't see a reason at this point in time to grant the side setback variance. Speaking for myself.
Okay.
My opinion is, I have a yard similar to this, approximately the same depth, and the 15-foot rear and side work very well. My shed complies. You get used to that.
I guess I'm of the same mind that Don is, and what we don't want to do is encourage people to come in here looking for variances when they don't need them. There's not a compelling reason. We're supposed to minimize the number of variances because we're varying from the code. I guess, you could push it to a vote, but I don't think it'll pass, personally. You need three yes votes to pass for what you want. You could table it and think about it and come back with a concession, say, well, maybe we could do this, but 15 and 15 is the code, and you haven't really shown us a reason why you can't comply. There's a practical reason.
I mean, it's a rather large shed, being visible from the road if we moved it to the center.
Well,
It'd be more behind your house then, which is what the side setback actually is designed, so that they're 15 feet for the house is also 15 feet for the shed. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and then we push it back. So that way it would be blocked a little bit more.
I can't speak for the other members of the board, but I understand what you're saying. If you have to propose changing your variance request so it's official, and change your side setback request, and your rear setback request stays the same. But I'm speaking for myself. I can't guarantee what the other members of the board are going to vote.
Okay.
I don't think anyone's going to make a motion to approve the application as written. So if there's no motion, the application pretty much dies as is, correct?
Well, the applicant has a right to withdraw his application and rethink it, because should the board deny your application, you cannot reapply with the same application for a period of 1 year.
So if I
You could
withdraw it
amend
right
your
now-
application formally. From what I understand is you're requesting to have a 15-foot side setback and a 5-foot rear setback.
Correct.
Is what you're,
Is what I've changed it to based on.
okay.
So, if you want to make that concession, 15-foot side and 5 rear?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess, we do, let's go through the standards. And then if someone wants to make a motion, for those.
No, let's go through standards.
Let me ask you this first, is this substantially changing the notice or the application for zoning?
He's asking for less of a variance,
Less.
so that would be okay. Not more of a variance, but less. Okay.
Correct.
It should-
But the same,
He's eliminating
He's
one of the
eliminating
variances.
one of the variances.
Keeping the other one the same.
He's asking to keep one variance and eliminate one, so
okay,
as long as he goes less,
Right.
then we're okay. Okay. Did you want to go through the standards, Don?
Let's see, essential character to the neighborhood. Yes, it is abutting the parkland owned by the town of Webster. Doesn't feel like it's a concern to adjacent property owners. There again, it's not a hardship of the information that is being offered. No other remedies. There are other remedies other than trying to keep open backyard. Significance, in my opinion, the application, even the amended application, is significant just because Reedy doesn't have the hardships that we generally look for. Physical and environmental conditions, there are none. There's no obstruction to comply. And self-created, all variances are self-created. I would make a motion to deny the application.
Second.
Do we want to give the applicant an opportunity to withdraw his application, or?
We can do that. Is it proper procedure once a motion's been made?
We didn't do secret yet either, so.
So,
It didn't vote yet.
Don, Mr. Howes has made a motion to deny the application. It's been seconded. You could table, or you could withdraw the application, rethink it, come back to the board. Because if it's denied for a full year.
Yeah, I'll withdraw and come back.
Okay, so the applicant's requested to withdraw the application. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you for your time.
Yep, that's all we have. Thank you. Okay, the next item, is the applicant here for the second item? Okay. 1016 John Leo Drive, pool shed. The applicant will be in just a second.
There's a term I've used forever a while before, but that's not, we were corrected. What do we
Yeah.
say instead of forever wild?
It's open space or...
Open space.
Open
parkland.
space, yeah.
Yeah, you must have been a real estate agent.
And I wrote it
I'll
down
elaborate
someplace.
after.
All right, ready?
Want to read that into the record, Corinne?
Yes, 1016 John Leo Drive pool shed. Located at 1016 John Leo Drive, applicant Marie West is requesting an area variance to allow the construction of a 14-foot by 18-foot pool shed in a location that is 9 feet closer to the front property line than the rear line of the main residence on a .43 acre parcel having SBL number 079.13-3-42, located in an R3 single-family residential district under section 225-36A sub 2 of the Code of the Town of Webster.
Okay, if you could state your name and address and tell us a little about your project, please.
Marie West, 1016 John Leo Drive. We just put in a pool in the fall, and our property is wider than it is deep. So we want some shade for the pool, and it'll be partial pool shed, partial overhang, so we can have some shade. And we really worked with the layout of the property to see if we could put it somewhere else. We tried to put it on a different side of the property, but it wouldn't provide any shade for the pool whatsoever. Actually, there'd just be sun in the overhang the entire time. So we tried to work with the layout of the property of where we could put a pool. I mean, we spent months trying to figure it out, and the best we could do was to put it where we would like it. It goes up along the side of the house by about 8 to 9 feet. But we don't ask for any side variances or variances on the back 15 feet of the property or the side 15 feet of the property. But we would like it to go up along the side of the house a little bit.
I visited the site, and again, lot size is a factor here. This lot is only 149 feet deep. It's plenty wide, and the 126 feet wide, but it's only 149 feet deep, which is very shallow for a lot of this type.
And if we were to put it any other place, we'd have to ask for a variance on the side.
Yeah. Now, it can't go behind the deck.
No, because the pool is there. And then if we were to go any further behind the deck on the other side, it would actually not provide any shade at all. Because the overhang wouldn't provide any shade for the pool, and it also wouldn't offer you any shade if you were under it because of where the sun is. The sun would be beating on it almost all day. So you wouldn't have any shade whatsoever.
Is it possible to move it further to the east so that the delta between the rear property line and the beginning line of the shed is less than the 9 feet?
Closer to the house. Closer to the house.
Closer to the pool?
That's the pool.
We
Shifting the whole
could
thing east.
by maybe a foot. There's not much space between the where we would want the shed and the actual pool. We could move it up, I mean, maybe a foot, but you would be cramped in that pool area.
There's not a lot of space between the pool
it's tight.
deck and where the shed would be. You've probably got a foot or two before you run right into the concrete of the pool deck.
True.
Yeah, when I visited the property, I went over it in detail, and the lot being so shallow, there's almost no way to get it behind the house and have it functional to the pool.
Yeah, it's,
I got the same impression. Yeah.
it's a very short backyard.
This meeting's open to the public. Anyone wishing to speak for or against this application, I believe our phone number is on the screen. If you want to call in, while we discuss, we'll wait for the phone to ring. Yep. Anybody else have any? Okay. All right, I'll run through the standards. The request is not out of character with the neighborhood. All those lots are shallow, so everything seems to be kind of cramped into their backyards, so it's not really out of character. There's quite a lot of room to the sideline, so, and they're not asking for a side setback variance, so there's really no negative impact on the neighbor to the south, so I don't see any detriment created to nearby properties. The benefit, as the applicant said, that's about the only place in the yard that she could put this structure to provide the shade and access to the pool that they desire. So it's not achievable by any other method. The request is somewhat substantial, but as the applicant said, they have that as close to the pool as they can get, practically speaking. Right. Okay. There's no adverse physical or environmental impacts to the site or neighborhood. The difficulty is somewhat self-created, but not totally. The shape of the lot is unusual, so they have to deal with that. It's not an undesirable change. Request is not significant. Okay. Pursuant to NYCR 617 of the Environmental Code, I'm going to ask that make a motion that we make this a type 2 secret.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. I don't think anybody's going to call in to speak in favor or against this project, so anybody else have any other comments?
No.
No. Okay. So I'd like to make a motion.
No.
Okay. I'd like to make a motion to allow the construction of a 14 by 18 foot pool shed in a location that is 9 feet closer to the front property line than the rear line of the main residence on a .343 acre parcel having SBL number 079.13-3-42, located in an R3 single-family district under section 225-36, sub A, sub 2 of the Code of Town of Webster, by applicant Marie West.
Second?
Mr. Barone?
Aye.
Mrs. Bola?
Aye.
Mr. Gennato?
Aye.
Mr. Schneider?
Aye.
Mr. Houseman?
Aye.
Okay, you have a couple conditions. You need a building permit,
We do need to work
1
on.
year meaningful construction. So the variance is good for a year, so I assume you're going to build it this summer, so.
Yes.
Okay, congratulations. Good luck with your project.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just after the print Thank you.
Be a couple minutes here while we do our sanitizing. Okay.
I can't breathe on it.
Okay, Corinne, want to read that into record, please? 232 Circle Lane.
232 Circle Lane Pool and Deck, located at 232 Circle Lane, applicants Jamie and Mark Palamone are requesting area variances to allow a 5-foot rear setback where 15 feet is required and an 8-foot side setback where 8-foot side setback where 15 feet is required, associated with the construction of an above-ground swimming pool and attached pool deck on a .51 acre parcel having SBL number 063.14-1-44, located in an R2 single-family residential district under section 225-47 of the Code of the Town of Webster.
Good evening. Could you
Good
state your name and address and tell us about your project?
Jamie Palamone and Mark Palamone, 232 Circle Lane, Webster, 14580.
I'm sorry, I'm nervous. I think my husband will talk.
Want me to talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're here tonight to request a variance for the pool variance and the deck variance for what?
Our location. Our location is where it needs to be because we got an email from the Department of Public Health, which we provided everybody a copy with, of where our leach lines are and where our septic is. Our house was built in the 1959, 1960. All the majority of the neighborhood, Shorewood and Circle Lane, the houses were built around then, so they all have septic and leach lines. So if you were to drive around, you would see a lot of things on one side of people's houses because they have to accommodate having a leach line and a septic tank. So when we had went to Clover to purchase a pool, they had asked us if we were on leach lines or septic, and we were, investigated it a little bit more, and they highly suggested not to put a pool on top of leach lines because of the weight of the water. So after looking at where they exactly were in our yard, where we wanted to put it close to the current deck to build off of it, we realized the only place that we could actually put it in our yard, unfortunately, is in the back corner. So that's unfortunate. That's why we have to place it there. But we have an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old that would really enjoy it.
I couldn't believe there weren't sewers there. I saw manholes in the road, but apparently they don't go down that far.
Well, no, Birch has it, and a couple houses on Shorewood have it. So when they built into the bluffs, they had sewer go down Birch and then a couple houses on Shorewood. And I think they went around asking neighbors from what we understand, because the people that we bought the house from they lived there for 42 years. So they said that they came through like 15 years ago and asked the residents if they wanted to switch over, and I think it was the neighborhood had denied it. But we didn't move in until 2014. We would have voted for it.
Now, okay, so you had the leach lines redone, you said, or they were done
We
just
did not
before you
have the
moved in?
leach lines redone. The homeowners that we had purchased the house from had them redone in 2011.
Okay.
And they were going the opposite direction, where we thought they originally were. And when we got the information from the Department of Public Health, we realized where exactly they were located. 24 feet out and spaced out 50 feet across. There's 4 lines total. So it takes up, we've seen 2 neighbors in our neighborhood across the street from us on Circle Lane that recently had to get their leach lines and their septic tank redone within this last year. And it literally looks like 3/4 of their yard is completely covered in hay because it takes up so much of your yard when you have to replace that. So we know for a fact that 2 neighbors across the street on Circle Lane that have recently had to, one in December and then one last year.
Now, I visited the site, and I asked why you can't move it to the west. So you want to explain that? Because that wouldn't be on leach lines, correct?
If we moved it over more to the west, there's a large maple tree that's located there that would cause, it's an above-ground pool, so it's already going to be ice cold. It's going to be very cold, and
The tree would definitely go over the pool at that point if we were to move it west.
yes, it would be, we would just have, we wouldn't want to, the whole purpose of having the pool is to be in the sun for us, so that we would, it's not a heated pool.
Every little bit of sunlight would.
And where we have it angled, there's also a property, like the lady behind us has, it's 120 feet by 20 feet of just random property that's not being used, because she has a 4-foot fence and then 20 feet and she has another fence. And she tends to that property probably once a year in the summer. So where we have it, where we would want to have the pool and the deck is where we can view the back of our house so we could see our children coming in and out. And not looking at our either side of our neighbors. But we also did get a letter from our neighbors next door, 236 Circle Lane, from Jeremiah and Jennifer Sherritt, that have been our neighbors for the past 6 years, and they've lived there for 15 years, and they're putting an addition on right now. And they gave us a letter supporting the pool decision, that they had no, issues with it being,
You have that letter with you?
Yeah, we
Why don't you
passed a letter
Yeah, why don't you just,
It's
you have it.
It's in the
Okay, so-
packet we received today,
Yep,
Gary.
they
Okay, so
gave it to
that's-
us, it's in the packet of information that
We'll
you
make
guys,
that part of the
we
record
don't
then.
have it right
Thank
now,
you. Thank you.
we
It's all right, we got it.
Okay, I was like, I can read it, if it helps.
Do you want me to read it into the record, or we just have a copy of it?
Yeah, you said you had a copy?
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Okay.
I believe, as long as, I just want to make that letter part of the record.
And they are the neighbors that are on the pool side?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
We've only identified the letter for the record, so it's clear.
A
Support.
letter was
Support.
received from Jeremiah and Jennifer Charette that live at 236 Circle Lane, giving their permission to the neighbors Jamie and Mark Palamone at 232 to install a pool and pool deck on their property. We understand they need a variance to do this, and we have no issues with their desire to add this feature to their backyard. And it's signed Mr. and Mrs. Charette at 236 Circle Lane. And dated June 8th.
The rear yard is interesting, because the neighbor has a chain link fence on the property line, then they have an 8-foot fence 20 feet in, which is code, and they let that just grow natural, right? They don't maintain that. So it's almost like the neighbors created their own natural buffer.
Yeah.
That's what it looks like, yeah.
Which is also ivy, a lot of ivy and weeds that come over into
Our,
because it's-
Yeah.
yeah.
which is another reason why we want the pool deck in that location, because if you see, like, when we first had the ivy and weed section, like, it was narrow, and now it's the full 8 feet. It was probably 2 feet 6 years ago, and ivy is just something that our neighbors suggested that you really need to dig it out
You do.
versus just pulling it to really get rid of it.
I might also add, you already got a variance for the side, for the fence.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yep,
Is
the
that
white
five-
vinyl fence,
5
yeah.
foot
So we're
fence?
already 3 feet in
From the property.
from the property line
Okay.
and to do the fence, the white vinyl fence, which we did about 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay. I'll tell you what, this meeting's open to the public. Anyone who wishes to speak for or against this project, just telephone in. The telephone number should be on your screen. We'll give that a few minutes. In the meantime, I'll make a motion pursuant to seeker section 617.5 of the environmental code. I'll make a motion for a type 2 seeker.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any other thoughts?
I just want to clarify what you said. The 5-foot setback, rear setback, you can't vary from that because it impacts the septic lines.
The leach
That's
lines,
correct.
The leach
field,
lines.
the leach lines.
They're spread out across the back of their house.
That's
Yep.
correct.
And the 8-foot setback, side setback, is impacted by a large maple tree to the west of the pool, and if you shifted it over,
It would be.
That's why you're asking for 8 foot there.
Yeah, half the tree would be on,
I
it would be
mean-
under the tree. The pole would be under the branches.
Okay. That's all. That's all I have.
What about shifting the swing set over?
We're
We're gonna have to.
We're gonna have to shift
we're
the
gonna
swing
have to
set.
Shift
Yeah.
it anyways, but
Yep.
just to fit the pool there,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, it's gonna be shifted.
Yeah, the swing set's gonna definitely have to be moved,
Yes.
for sure. If not come down completely.
So what I understood is they're moving the swing set to where the old septic system used to be. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Okay, I don't think anybody's going to call in.
Well, and it can't go in the other corner either because there's another large tree
Right.
in the northwest corner.
And our septic's over there too,
Yeah, that's where the septic tank is, in the other side.
close to the house.
There's just nothing left of your yard.
Yeah, I could understand why they want the pool visible from their deck on their house too.
Yeah.
It's on that side of the house. It's just behind the septic system. That's what you're doing, okay. Anybody want to run through the standards?
I'll go through them.
Okay.
Like you stated, the house is built in the 1960s, 61, I think you said. So I don't think it's out of character with the neighborhood. The questions of the board ran through the gamut of, you're currently on a septic, leach lines, there's a tree that prohibits moving the pool to the west. So I don't think that you can achieve it by any other method. The variance is substantial, but there really isn't another spot in your yard to put that pool, based on the questions that were asked. I don't think there's any physical, environmental conditions that we have to worry about. And like Don said, most of these variance requests are self-created, but based on your testimony and the things that you said about your leach lines, and I don't think that there's any other place to put that pool in your yard. So you want me to make a motion?
Please.
Please.
So I'll make a motion to approve an area variance to allow a 5-foot rear setback where 15 feet is required, and a 8-foot side setback where 15 feet is required associated with the construction of an above-ground swimming pool and attached pool deck on .51 acre parcel having SBL number 063.14-1-44 located in an R2 single-family residential district under section 225-47 of the Code of Town of Webster.
Second.
Done.
Mr. Denera?
Aye.
Mr. Hauser?
Aye.
Mr. Schneider?
Aye.
Mrs. Boland?
Aye.
Mr. Barone?
All right. Okay, you have your variance, a couple conditions. One, your meaningful construction. I know you want to do it this summer, so, and you need a permit, obviously.
Yep, oh yes,
Okay, great.
great.
Good luck, enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, how do we read the next item into the record? Do we have a specific wording for that?
I'm assuming the way it's on the sheet?
Yeah, it's just a determination, just the way it's worded on the sheet here.
Yeah.
Okay. Sanitizing. I gotta keep the podium clean.
I'm sorry? Okay.
Neighbors first.
Well, who's the applicant?
In the back.
No, I know, but
Well, we have petitioners.
What,
You want to read in the record first?
the Webster Citizens Board should be the,
Appropriate land use.
yeah, they should be the applicant first, so they should be
Okay.
in the first instance making their,
Okay, make the presentation.
yes.
Okay.
But you want to read it into the record
Yes.
before they speak on it?
Okay, Karen, can you get into the record, please?
CEA Fresh Farms Project at State Road. Petitioners, Webster Where Open Space is Worth Preserving Incorporated, and Webster Citizens for Appropriate Land Use are requesting an interpretation of the zoning code to determine if a proposed greenhouse farming operation is a permitted use in the large lot residential district under section 225-108D1 and 225-108E sub 2 sub A of the Code of the Town of Webster and pursuant to Supreme Court Monroe County Court Order Index E 2019
We got this.
011898 dated May 18, 2020.
Good evening.
State your name, please, and address, please.
My name is Tim Young. I live at 1019 Pathway Lane in Webster. Tonight, I'm speaking on behalf of the Webster Citizens for Appropriate Land Use, and I want to talk about the neighborhood and why we believe the town code does not allow this project as proposed. You all have this hard copy. And that's what I'll be speaking to.
Mr. Young, before we get underway,
Yes. Yeah, I can't tell if this one's on either.
anybody out here? Test, test, test. No? They're all on, okay.
Thanks, Sharon.
Mr. Young, obviously, under all circumstances, we want the record to be clear. But we want it to be particularly clear when we know there's an application that there's a great deal of interest in, which this one certainly has. So for the record purposes, it would be appreciated if when you, for example, a moment ago, you referred to everyone has this record here or this document. To the extent that you can, please be specific when you're referring to a document, a photograph. So if
Okay.
this record is ultimately reviewed, whoever's reviewing it can be certain as to what matters you are referencing.
Okay.
All right, thank you. And so let's be clear before you get underway. You did pass a document out tonight. I think we already had it, but let's be clear as to what it is and how many pages it is and what it contains.
Okay. So this is a presentation on the CEA Grow Factory and why we feel it's inappropriate for the large lot residential district.
Good. Now, as I recall, this was a PowerPoint.
Correct.
Is that right? Which was not available to you tonight for other reasons.
Yeah,
And so it's the PDF of the PowerPoint which you've put together.
correct.
Okay. Great.
It is 18 pages in total.
And the front page of the document is it's entitled CEA Grow Factory Inappropriate for LL Residential District. There's a photograph of a crop field, correct, on the first page?
That is correct.
All right, and then on the back page, there is a narrative summary.
Correct.
Okay, great, thank
And
you.
that's number page 18.
Okay, fantastic. I think we're going to do too, just in case we need to, why don't we mark this as Webster Citizens number 1, okay? If there's other documents you want to submit or have us review, we'll mark them accordingly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so on page 2, the first address the scale of this project. It is proposed at 2.37 million square feet of buildings. That's an equivalent of 66 football fields or 23 average-sized Wegmans stores. And there is a diagram of the proposed project here so that you can see what the magnitude of it is. Page 3, the impacts of this project. This project proposes to develop farmland in a residential area for what is an industrial use. It's industrial because of the scale and impact of this project is that of a factory. There are 23-foot tall buildings, 33-foot tall water towers, loading docks, packaging areas, a warehouse, offices, and a canteen or cafeteria area. This project is certainly of the magnitude that it impairs the aesthetic resources and neighborhood character and is wholly inappropriate in a large lot residential district. Page 4. So page 4 is basically a statement of the section of the town code for large lot residential. I know you all know this, but I would like to state this for people at home and for the record. Town code section 225.12 states the intent of the large lot zoning district is to encourage large lot residential development in areas where conditions of the environment, availability of utilities, and surrounding land use patterns, and they dictate that residential densities and the amount of land covered by impervious surface remain low. And I want to address each of those 5 elements of that statement of intent. Page 5, conditions of the environment. the current conditions of the environment in that area. The 111 acres of prime farmland, this is according to a U.S. Department of Agriculture survey. It's currently a working farm. There is a tributary of 4 Mile Creek that runs through the property, and 3 acres of federally protected wetlands. What this project proposes to do is excavate 111 acres of prime farmland, remove over 10,000 cubic yards of U.S. Department of Agriculture highly productive soils from the site completely, impound 21.8 million gallons of rainwater that would normally flow in some way into that 4 Mile Creek tributary, reroute the 4 Mile Creek tributary, fill in the wetlands, and light pollution. CEA will tell you that they'll be deploying shades. However, if you look at the next 2 pages, 6 and 7, page 6 is a photograph of the Integro tomato factory in Ontario. That's taken from Tractor Supply parking lot across the street, and that was taken March 19th of this year. On page 7 is the Integro factory from 2.5 miles away in a residential area, as you see the houses there, this past winter. Note, Integro has shades, but can using them be enforced? Page 8. Availability of...
Can I just
Yes.
interrupt for one second? The photographs that you reference on page 6 and 7, are those photographs that you took, or did you become aware that those were photographs of that location at the time that you indicated?
The one from March, I took that picture myself,
Number 6?
page 6.
Okay.
And I'm not sure who took the picture on page 7, but it was sent to one of the neighbors adjacent to the property, and she forwarded it to me.
All right, thank you.
Excuse me, can I have a handout? My pages aren't lining up with what you're presenting this evening.
Yeah, Chris.
Thank you.
Oh, never mind. All set.
I had a spare.
Okay, page 8, availability of utilities. Based on a Cornell study and data from the National Center for Biotechnology Information, this was performed by a professional engineer. That study, or that calculation indicates 10 megawatts of electrical power will be required to provide artificial light for these grow houses 16 hours a day. That energy draw is the equivalent of 8,189 homes. It would require new transmission and distribution lines, and would likely require a new power substation. The project requires installation of a 5,000-foot sewer line down State Road. Capacity of water line needs further study. We have done an analysis that is in conflict with CEA's analysis, so we feel that that needs further review. We don't believe that the capacity is there in the current water line. Page 9. Surrounding land use patterns. This is a rural setting with a mix of large lot residential homes and traditional farming. Currently a working farm and surrounded by working farms. On page 10 is a photograph of State Road looking east, just east of the intersection of State and Salt Road. I took this picture a couple days ago, and it's meant to depict the rural nature of the rural setting that will be significantly impacted. On page 11 is a photograph of the western portion of the proposed project. Again, this was taken a couple days ago. As you see, it's a working farm field being prepped for planting. This is just to the west of the Kubrick property, which is sort of in the middle of this project. On page 12 is a picture of the eastern end of the proposed project. Also, you can see it's a field that's been worked and prep for seeding. Page 13, so the next two pages are to show the residential nature. So basically on the south side of State Road is where this project is proposed. That's all working farmland with one property in the middle of it. And on the north side are homes, and those are depicted in these two slides, page 13 and 14. Again, for the record, I took these photos Friday, I think it was. Okay, on page 15, another impact to the neighborhood is the proposed vehicle traffic. CEA proposes 40 truck trips per day. These are tractor trailers. That would be the equivalent of one truck every 16 and a half minutes. They have stated that the workday would be 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., an 11-hour workday. Additionally, they propose 299 employees coming and going each day. We presume one per car, which is the equivalent of 600 car trips per day. I don't know what the current traffic is on that section of State Road, but I know it's not that much. This will certainly impact the peace and quiet, which is typical of a traditionally rural large lot district. Additionally, this section of State Road has little or no paved shoulder. This is a significant risk to children walking to and waiting at bus stops on the very small shoulder of the road, particularly if visibility is low due to weather or darkness, or roads are icy. This is also a common route for bicyclists, and that becomes a lot riskier with tractor trailers and 600 car trips with virtually no paved shoulder. Picture's worth 1,000 words, so on page 16, this is the eastern end of the project, and you can see the shoulder of the road is quite narrow. There's basically no paved shoulder to the right of that fog line, and the only bailout area is in that ditch to the right. So this is a significant concern. Page 17, the conditions of the environment, the availability of utilities, surrounding land use patterns, all dictate that densities remain low. This project is proposed to have 54 acres of buildings, which is 38% lot coverage. And the amount of land covered by impervious surface shall remain low. This project proposes paving and construction of 72 acres of impervious surfaces, combination of glass, concrete, asphalt, and rubber-lined ponds. Well, that's more than 51% of the 141 acres. Page 18. In summary, this development would quite simply destroy the neighborhood, ruining its agricultural character and causing significant disruption to the daily lives of the surrounding residents. The conditions of the environment, availability of utilities, and surrounding land use patterns make the intent of this zoning district clear, and that intent should inform the board's interpretation of the disputed ordinances. That's all I have to present. Okay.
Yep, we're good, thank you.
Thank you.
We have several people that want to speak, so we're going to let you folks do the talking.
Okay.
Could you state your name and address, please?
Evening, everyone. My name is John Tantillo. I'm an attorney for Webster Citizens for Appropriate Land Use with Knopf Schatz, 2 State Street, Rochester. Before you tonight is an appeal of a determination by the town that the CEA Fresh Farms project complies with the town's zoning code. and does not require variances. Specifically raised are appeals related to two issues: whether the project is a permitted use and whether the project runs afoul of the code's maximum lot coverage limit. Now, I spoke with your attorney a couple times, and it sounds like he's keeping everyone pretty well informed here, so I'm going to assume I get general familiarity with the issues, but if anyone needs any clarification at any point, please do not hesitate to stop me and ask.
Mr. Tantillo, similarly with Mr. Young, why don't we, at least we be clear as to the documents that you want to be sure that we have,
Sure.
if any, or those that you might be referring to. I think we have everything, but let's be clear on that.
I was not planning on referring to any documents, but the two most important ones, I think, are our two letters directly to this board from November of last year, dated November 18th and November 14th.
And that's on the Knopf-Shaw letterhead.
Correct.
Okay, and all board members have that, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Mr. Donoghue, you have those?
I do not.
Okay, let's probably make sure that
I have a couple copies.
he has those. I think I have an extra copy too.
And I should also note that the November 14th letter does attach a report from the Town of Webster Conservation Board related to the Intergrove project, dated May 3rd, 2016? No, May 9th, 2016.
Thank you.
Mr. Tantillo, thank you.
All right, I'd like to start with the lot coverage issue, which is, obviously a bit more technical. So zoning code 225-73 is a supplemental code section that specifically governs agricultural uses. Its heading is simply that, agricultural uses. Now, the developer is claiming that the project is an agricultural use, so uncontroversially, section 73 would apply if that was the case. So section 73 has 6 separate subsections. And they're labeled A through F. For 4 out of 6 of those subsections, A, B, E, and F, it is undisputed that they apply to every aspect of the farm operation. Subsection C, however, is expressly limited to on-site residences for farm laborers. It says so very clearly and succinctly right in the subsection. That's what it deals with. It's about on-site residences for farm hands, farm laborers. Subsection D contains no such language and says simply, except as here and above provided, all zoning provisions and restrictions as to single dwelling units of residential district R3 shall apply. So, subsection D of zoning code 225-73, which is the agricultural use section, says the dimensional limits for R3 single-family residential uses apply. Essentially, what this subsection recognizes is the fact that agricultural uses might find themselves located in, all sorts of different neighborhoods in various towns. And to mitigate the impact those uses might have, the town made sure that the uniform dimensional regulations are applied to those uses. Now, what the developer wants this board to believe is that subsection D, without any reference to farm laborer residences, is limited in application to only farm laborer residences. No meaningful explanation is offered as to why D is treated differently from A, B, E, and F. Because there's no reason that it should be. As relevant here, the project does not meet the lot coverage limitations under that interpretation. They would be limited to a 20% lot coverage, but the proposed use is double that, or roughly double that. I think it's 38%. So instead, the developer offers an interpretation that results in their project having absolutely no lot coverage limitation whatsoever. This self-serving interpretation would obviously lead to absurd results, as they're essentially claiming that they could build 100 acres of buildings with absolutely no regard to lot coverage. The Democrat and Chronicle ran a story on this project about a week ago, and it had a pretty striking comparison in there. They pointed out that the square footage of this project is 20 times larger than a typical Lowe's or Home Depot. 20 times. Now, I think it's a fairly uncontroversial statement to say that any interpretation of the zoning code that allows a development of that magnitude to drop right in the middle of a residential neighborhood is an absurd result. And there's a rule in New York that when you're interpreting codes, you're supposed to avoid absurd results like that. Highlighting the absurdity is the purpose of the zoning district that the developer chose. They picked the large lot residential zoning district. And in the code, it specifically states that that district was created to keep impervious surfaces low. It's right there, the first subsection of the large lot residential zoning district. The purpose of this district, keep down impervious surfaces. Despite that fact, the developer is going to come in front of you guys and say, there's no limit on impervious surfaces. It's nonsensical as a starting point. The purpose statement is an interpretive aid that you guys are entirely within your rights to look at when interpreting this code provision. Now, I did have a chance to look at the developer's submission that was submitted ahead of this meeting, and I'd just briefly like to address a couple points that they raised. First, it would not be, as the developer claims...
And let me just interrupt you, Mr.
Yes.
Kendall. That's
Yep, that's a good point.
their submission. I think it's dated June 4th, was it?
June 4th?
Yes.
June 4th. That's on the Woods Oviatt letterhead. That's a 4-page letter from Attorney Warren Rosenbaum, and then accompanying that is Exhibit A, which is a 2-page letter from the New York State Agriculture and Markets
That's the one.
Office, right?
Correct.
Okay.
It would not be, as the developer claims, nonsensical to require agricultural uses to abide by the 20% lot coverage limit. Because virtually all agricultural uses already do by their very nature. It's a low lot coverage use. Their arguments are largely non sequiturs in this context. I don't want to say they're trying to confuse the issues, but they don't really address the points that are in front of you guys. The developer claims that there's some ambiguity here that needs to be interpreted in their favor, and it just unequivocally is not ambiguous. There's no ambiguity in the provision. The developers are trying to manufacture ambiguity by attempting to read into this subsection language that just is not there. There's nothing in subsection D that says anything about on-site farm laborers. It's just not there. And for them to say that, oh, there's some ambiguity as to whether it applies to them, it's a manufactured issue. Finally, the developer claims that the common sense interpretation that we're offering would render the language quote, as to single-family dwellings superfluous. That is incorrect. I had another matter before this board last year. It was at Fast Track Cafe on Ridge Road. And an issue there was this, you guys have this rule about buffers for residential uses in districts, or where the districts abut non-residential districts. And under that rule, residential uses are treated differently from commercial uses. Residents can go places that a commercial use can't. And that's just one example of how that language is not superfluous, because under this code, a residence would be treated differently in that area than a commercial use. So what the code is saying is, if there's a farm in a buffered area, then it could be treated as a residential use for purposes of that particular rule. That's all I'd like to say about the lot coverage issue, or the agricultural use section issue. As to the permitted use, the developers referred you guys to a handful of outside agencies, and I want to really drive home the fact that those agencies' opinions have no bearing on your guys' decision. What the Webster Town Code and Zoning Code says is a decision for the Webster Zoning Board of Appeals, and what Ag and Market says does not have any bearing on how Webster's interpretation of the term agricultural use is decided. Zoning concerns the use of land, and the use of land here is industrial. From the outside, the project is, for all intents and purposes, a factory. And the fact that inside, the product they're developing is lettuce has no bearing on whether or not this is an agricultural or industrial use. It's the land that we're concerned about here. So for everyone around this building, whether or not they're manufacturing tables or spinach, it's going to look the same to them. That's not what zoning's about. To that end, the town included the word customary in section 73. To which we're asked, that's a subsection F. Customary agricultural operations or farming may be conducted in all zones. It's the word customary that we're trying to get you guys to give effect to tonight. Mr. Young got up and talked about all the reasons that this isn't a customary farm use. This isn't going to impact the surrounding properties in the way all the farms that are already there do. It's a very cutting-edge new technology that I think the state should address before local zoning codes like this are kind of interpreted after the fact to allow it. For these reasons, we're asking the board to find that the project is not a permitted use in the district and that the project runs afoul of the 20% lot coverage limit that does apply to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Folks have another speaker?
And actually, looks like it should be Tim Stevens, so if you guys have any questions,
Mr. Chantel, why don't you stay at the podium? I'm sure there are some questions. Well, I have a question. When we look at 22573D, like David, and it references provisions, restrictions as to single dwelling units. Is the code speaking to a proposed use that would include single-family dwelling units, as opposed to what's being proposed here?
I think generally a customary agricultural use will have some residential on it, so I think that's probably a reasonable thing to say, but I don't think that changes the fact that the project as a whole needs to comply with those dimensional restrictions.
Well, so what I'm trying to understand is that if the provision is about single dwelling units, but the proposal here doesn't include single dwelling units, correct?
Oh, no, I don't think, sorry, subsection D is not limited to application to single-family dwelling units. It's saying that for anything that you're trying to build as an agricultural use, you need to comply with the dimensional restrictions that would be applicable for a single-family dwelling unit. And, I mean, the fact that the project complies with all of them except for the lot coverage limitation, it shows that that does scale out to agricultural uses. It's just the atypical nature of this particular use that's butting up against it.
So I guess why do you believe that it applies in whole R3, given the fact that these are proposed as greenhouses?
Because that's what the code says. It doesn't say anything to the contrary. It's saying we recognize that these uses are going to find themselves in multiple zoning districts throughout the town, and as a way to impose some consistent regulation, here's the standard that's in the zoning code now that you guys should look to for determining what's permissible and what's not.
But when we look at residential D3, it covers more applications, correct, than just the single-family units? Or they have to keep referring to single-family, single-dwelling units?
Single family.
Residential D3? I'm sorry.
Apartments allowed in all districts.
Not sure what that's referring to. You mean the district?
Right.
Yeah, it's talking about the R3 zoning district. It's used those dimensional restrictions.
I guess I'm not understanding. The 22573 incorporates those provisions of the R3 single-family residential district relevant to separate residences.
Apply the dimensional restrictions of the R3 single-family district as they would apply to a single-family dwelling, is what the section is saying. So you've got buildings here, an R3 single-family dwelling is a building there. They're both subject to the same dimensional restrictions.
See, the problem I have is that follows C, which refers to providing housing for farm laborers and farm hands, or members actually, family members actually engaged in doing work on the farm. And D refers to, as our attorney indicated, single-family units.
Well,
And you're right, it doesn't provide distinction,
It doesn't.
and I'd also point out that
but
D
it
and F,
follows some sort of logic. There again, my opinion.
Well, and the way I read it is typically when we have, the code indicates some set of requirements, and then if the next section beneath it is applicable for, in this distance, if I'm looking at C and the residences and the buildings for farmhands, if the next subset of instructions applies to C, it would be indented and then it would be C-1.
You're right.
As opposed, where if I look at, I'm pulling up the large lot, section 225-12, and the R3 single family and the R2 single family, when it's, the minimum yard needs to be this wide, and then if it's on a major highway, subset 1 is this, and corner lots, subset 2 is this. So I think they need to be, just as I would interpret it, they're separate statements not connected to each other.
that's actually a phenomenal point to the degree that I'm kicking myself for not raising it in my own letters. I should have put that before the court when we were discussing this before, and it should have been brought to you guys. That's exactly how a reliant section that, builds on the section above it is drafted, and that's how your code is drafted. You have subsections upon subsections upon subsections. And if this was meant to apply to only subsection C, farmhand residences, it would be subsection C1 instead of D.
Yeah, from an engineering perspective, Corin's logic applies.
That's all I am as an engineer.
But it appears also that they're distinguishing how farmhand residences were treated as apart from non-farmhand residences.
I don't understand why it wouldn't just be part of C in that case. It would just, even not even subsection C1, but just an additional sentence in subsection C. Subsection C contains limitations on those farmhand residences. Why they break it out into its own separate subsection is unknown to me.
I think I'll leave that up to the board's interpretation, but I think the types of residences that are being referred to in each one of those sections are different.
Could you...
I think.
But are we discussing the residences, or are we discussing the conditions that apply to the land use?
Coverage and that sort of thing. In other words, it mentions residences. It mentions residence, but does it apply to all conditions, including lot coverage? If they didn't put residence in there and just said everything in R3 applies to this, that would be crystal clear, but that's not exactly, they mentioned residences.
Which would be when the issue about, like my example with the buffer district comes up, Residences are treated differently under certain provisions of the code. So I think they're affording agricultural uses a couple more rights by saying, as applies to residential uses in an R3 district, as opposed to just saying, as applying the dimensional restrictions of an R3 district in general.
The residences under C are qualified, different from single dwelling units, right? These are residences for his farm laborers.
What's the,
Well, my
I guess I'm not following the import of that.
My point is that when we talk about indenting, that would suggest that we're talking about the same subject matter, and why it's not indented but it's separate subsection here appears to be because there's a distinction between single dwelling units and residence for farm labor.
So if this were to apply to only single dwelling units, it would say that. It would say, for single dwelling units on an agricultural use, use the R3 zoning district. This doesn't say that. It says all zoning provisions and restrictions for single dwelling units in the R3 district shall apply as a general statement for the agricultural use, supplementary zoning section. It could very easily have been written to say what I think you're suggesting it might say. And that's just not the case.
You didn't hear me? I'm sorry. I was leaning backwards.
Well, that's the core issue,
Yes.
lot coverage. Does the R3 lot coverage apply or not? And that's something we need to discuss.
Yes.
And I just want to highlight again, if it doesn't, then there's no limitation. It's silent. The district is created to keep lot coverage low, and that interpretation results in no limit. That can't be the interpretation. If that were the interpretation, I would hope the town board is putting a moratorium on development so you could fix the code. That's just a nonsensical interpretation that would result in disaster.
Other questions?
Not on this point.
No, it's a lot to digest. I appreciate.
We've been working with it for a while. I understand it's
Yeah,
an intricate one.
we got paperwork throughout the week, and everyone was 10, 12 pages, a lot of reading, and everybody's been hitting the books here in the code books, so we need a little time to digest everything you've presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you have ability to both see the visual and the audio out in the waiting room when the other parties come in?
It's been pretty good, yeah.
Okay, because there may be an opportunity to have some rebuttal, and I want to make sure that your entire group is able to hear what the other party says.
Yep, I think that'll work.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
It was, okay.
So I did fundraise my house.
Okay.
And then I gave it to Josh.
Okay, yeah.
We're sanitizing again for those folks at home watching and wondering.
When are we going to hear from the public then?
Well, they'll have an opportunity to call in. We'll listen to the formal presentations first, then give the public an opportunity to comment. Hi, could you state your name, address, please?
Good evening.
Yeah.
Good evening.
Good
My name
evening.
is Warren Rosenbaum, and I'm one of the attorneys for the developer, CEA Fresh Farms.
Okay.
And with me tonight is one of my partners, Jerry Goldman. We're both from the law firm of Woods Oviatt Gilman at 1900 Bausch and Lomb Place in Rochester, New York. And also in the audience with us is Keith Cernick, S-E-R-N-I-C-K, who is in-house counsel and an advisor to the developer. And we also have two representatives of our clients, consulting engineers, BME Associates, Peter Vars and Rebecca Glitch, who are here to the extent that any technical issues regarding the project may come up during the course of the presentations this evening. I first want to thank the board on behalf of the developer and its staff for all its prior courtesies, and as well as the opportunity to address you tonight. This is a very important project for my client, and a very important project I would submit for the town of Webster, for a number of reasons. We obviously are mindful of the degree of public interest that's been expressed in this project, and we do want to start out by speaking briefly about what I think we can all agree on is the role of the Zoning Board of Appeals concerning this matter. We were able to hear part of the presentation made by the applicants, and in many respects, it mirrored the speech they made to the planning board several months ago, as a result of which the planning board unanimously approved the project. But we don't want to deal with planning board issues or policy issues tonight. What we want to do is speak to you about what we believe the zoning board's role is, and I don't want the board to think that we are lecturing to the board, because we think the board itself has a wealth of experience. How do I know this? My partner, Jerry Goldman, is kind of the dean of zoning land use lawyers in Monroe County. And he tells me that this board is very well qualified and has a wealth of experience. Not only that, the board is assisted by a very able staff and able counsel, and I'm confident that the board will be advised that its role in this matter is to read the plain language, we think the plain language of the code, and reach what we think will be the obvious conclusions from the facts. I'd like to hand out and make part of the record, before we begin, a number of items, and I'll try to do this as efficiently as I can. Some of these items may have already been delivered to the board members, but for the sake of completeness, I'm going to hand out a suitable number of sets of a number of exhibits. One is a letter from me, from Woods Oviatt Gilman, dated June 4, 2020, addressed to the Town of Webster Zoning Board of Appeals. The letter is on 4 pages, together with a 2-page Exhibit A, the Exhibit A being a letter dated November 5, 2019, from the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, signed by Michael Latham, Latham Director. Number 2, I am going to hand you a PDF of a PowerPoint, which I believe has already been delivered to each member of the board. It is a PowerPoint that consists of 6 numbered pages plus an Exhibit A. The Exhibit A is the same letter from Mr. Latham from the Department of Agricultural and Markets that was attached to my exhibit, the June 4, 2009 letter. I'm also going to be distributing to each of the board members sections of the town's zoning code, not because I don't believe that the board has a copy of the zoning code, but because I printed out what I believe to be the pertinent, and perhaps the only pertinent provisions of the code that we need to discuss this evening, and in which I've taken the liberty of highlighting certain portions of the sections, and the sections I'm going to be handing out to the board now are sections 225-12, entitled Large Lot Single Family Residential District. Also section 225-73, entitled Agricultural Uses. And section 225-11, entitled R-3 Single Family Residential District. again, I've highlighted what I believe to be the most pertinent portions of each of those sections. So if I can hand this to Mr. Benway or Mr. Artuso, whichever you prefer, I would ask that these be distributed to the board. May I do that at this time?
Of course.
Yes, please.
Mr. Artuso? PDF, PowerPoint, and a letter, and nine sets each of the three code sections that I've highlighted. Yes, just spread on the record. You could guess one of each of these out, or one of each of those out. Would be appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Artuso.
Mr. Rosenbaum, while that's being passed out, you mentioned early on that, quote, you saw some of the applicant's presentation.
I did.
I just want to be sure you saw some of it because you weren't watching it 100% of the time, or that you had any difficulties out in the room hearing or observing the applicants.
No, Mr. DeMarco, we were perfectly able to hear all
Okay.
the statements and words that were made at the podium here, as well as the comments and questions from the board members and council. No, that worked out very well.
Great.
While Mr. Artuso is handing that out, I'd like to talk a little bit about Section 225, 108D1, which I think is what we're operating here, and that's not one of the sections I've handed out, but that is the section that talks about what the job or role is of the Zoning Board of Appeals in respect of an interpretation of the code, which is what we're talking about here tonight, which I believe, and although I'll defer to my partner, Jerry Goldman, who's the expert on this, but I believe this is considered a Type 2 action under seeker. And under 225, 108D1, the board is entitled, in its discretion and based upon its own understanding and reading of the code, that it may do one of three things. And one of those three things are addressed to what is a claimed to have been an apparent or an assumed finding or ruling previously made by the town's Department of Public Works and/or its chief code enforcement officer, because we wouldn't be here today unless there were an appeal asking for an interpretation. So somebody necessarily had to make a determination before the project got to the planning board based upon Judge Donofrio's decision. Somebody must have made a determination that this was in fact a permitted use in the large lot district, and that number two, the 20% maximum lot coverage limit in the R3 residential district did not apply to this agricultural use, because if those determinations had not been made, presumably, it never would have got to the planning board, according to the project opponents. So the board is called upon to make an interpretation with respect to those two issues. Is this a expressly permitted use in the large lot residential district? And number two, whether the area requirements, the coverage requirements of the 20% maximum area applicable to the R3 district is to be imported into the large lot district with respect to an agricultural use. And with respect to those issues, the board can do one of three things. It can reverse those rulings. In other words, you can determine that your building department or your chief code enforcement officer is wrong in his or her interpretation of the code. The board, in the alternative, can determine that it is going to modify those findings in some form or fashion, either with respect to the question of whether or not the project is a permitted use in the LL district, for example, or it can affirm or agree with those rulings. And we are respectfully submitting that the plain wording of the code, which I think the board is bound to apply, using a common sense approach to what the code says and how all the words fit together, and to try to harmonize how the scheme of the code fits together, using the words without disregarding any of the words, try to fit it all together. And I think that the conclusion you're going to come to is a fairly easy one and a certain one. I think you'll be very comfortable with it when we're done with this presentation and after you finish your deliberations. So I see that Mr. Artuso has finished handing out those exhibits. So the first issue is, does the project constitute an expressly permitted agricultural use in the large lot district in which it is located? Section 225.12 lists all of the uses that are expressly permitted as of right in the large lot district. And 1225.12A6 says, quote unquote, agricultural uses. What could be clearer than that? Is an agricultural use a permitted use in the industrial district or the commercial district or other districts? No. But is it expressly permitted in this district? Yes. And does the large lot district have its own area requirements? Yes. And is the farm use in question subject to those area requirements? Yes. So unlike section 225.73, which deals with accessory uses as an agricultural use, where it says that an agricultural use is permitted in any district, we have a district that is expressly permitted without making a reference to an accessory use. This is not an accessory use in the large lot district. It's a permitted principal use in a large lot district. So we need to distinguish 225.73, which is only applicable if it's an accessory use in the large lot district, from the expressly permitted use in the large lot district. So we would submit to you that much of what is in 225.73 is irrelevant. And I'll get into that in a bit more, and I'm sure the board will have some questions, and I'll be happy to address them to the best of my ability when those questions come up. Another question has come up, and that is, if we're going to have an agricultural use in the town of Webster, must it be something called a customary agricultural use? Customary agricultural operations, I believe that's the verbiage that Mr. Tantillo was talking about to the board pursuant to section 225.73F. And bear in mind again that that only applies if it's an accessory use in the district. We are dealing with an agricultural use which is an expressly permitted use. So what is a customary agricultural operation? We don't believe it applies to the large lot district. But even if it were to apply to the large lot district, we are growing hydroponic lettuce. I don't think I need to resort to a learned treatise or an encyclopedia to tell the board that hydroponics have been around. I'm 73 years old and it's been around since I was a child. So I would respectfully submit, and some references to that are in the letter that I submitted to the board dated June the 4th. There's nothing that's uncustomary about growing hydroponic food. So we believe that the plain language of the code shows that the project is a permitted use in the large lot district, and even to the extent that the board felt that somehow we have to apply the customary agricultural operations, bear in mind that there's absolutely no definition for that term in this code. No definition in the code whatsoever. And the board would have to make it up out of the whole cloth in order to come up with an interpretation that the code itself doesn't provide. And I believe that those of you who are experienced on the board, as well as your counsel, can tell you that the code must be construed in favor of landowners when there is an ambiguity. Do I think there's an ambiguity? No. But to the extent the board feels there's an ambiguity, we believe that the board must construe it in favor of the landowner, in this case Mr. Weber, who is one of the applicants for this project, as well as CEA Fresh Farms. The second issue, which I believe Mr. Tantello spent the bulk, if not all of his time on, dealt with the 20% maximum lot coverage area, where Mr. Tantillo wants to import all of the bulk or area requirements of the R3 residential district into the large lot district as it applies to a farm. Now, I think the board will quickly find out that, will quickly see this is completely unreasonable and can't possibly have been the intention of the code drafters. 225-773C, and again, we're assuming, for the sake of argument, that 225-73 accessory use is applicable to a use that's expressly permitted use in the large lot district and therefore is not an accessory use. But let's assume, for the sake of our discussion, that 225-73 applies to an agricultural use even though it's in the large lot district. 225-73C allows the owner of an agricultural use to build separate residence for farm laborers, farm hands, and others. And that subsection is immediately followed by subsection 225-73D pertaining to agricultural accessory uses in general, and states that, quote, except as hereinabove provided, all zoning provisions and restrictions, quote, as to single-family units, end quote, of residential district R3 shall apply. Now, what the opponents of the project would like the board to do is ignore the words as to single-family units and pretend that those words don't exist, and instead to read it as follows: except as hereinabove provided, all zoning provisions and restrictions of residential district R3 shall apply. Because really that's what you'd have to conclude if you want to agree with Mr. Tantillo's position. And if, in fact, you couldn't, based on Mr. Tantillo's argument, you couldn't pick and choose which one of the R3 bulk requirements apply and which don't. You'd have to apply all of them. Otherwise, you would be acting arbitrarily by applying some and not others. So if all of the bulk requirements of the R3 district were to apply to agricultural uses in the large lot district, then the words as to single-family units would have been unnecessary, completely unnecessary. So why would we give import to words that are superfluous or unnecessary or irrelevant? Because really that's what Mr. Tantillo's argument is. So just look at the language and imagine those words being deleted. Now, the project opponents would have the board apply 275-73D as if those words were not there. But those words are there to make clear, and the only reason possible that it could be in there is to make clear that the only bulk requirements of the R3 district that apply are those that are specific to farmhand dwellings. If you're going to build residences on your project to house your farm laborers, then you better have decent housing for farm laborers, which includes habitable floor area, yard area, and so forth. But the thing about this project is we're not having any residences on this project. We're arguing about something that's never going to happen here. This is a project that's not going to have any single-family residences on it. So I have to ask the question, and I think the board can easily supply the answer: how does this even apply to this project? So, and again, if you look at the letter, the June 4th letter, I showed you how inconsistent it would be if you applied all the bulk and area requirements of the R3 district and imported them into the large lot district as it applied to farm agricultural uses. And you can see there's differences and conflicts between minimum frontage, minimum front setback, minimum rear setback, minimum side yard, there's just two completely different sets of rules in the R3 and the large lot district that simply, you can't cram this round peg into a square hole. Now, I understand, and the developer understands that there's a lot of controversy about the project, but what important projects, economically important projects, don't have any controversy? Can you think of even one? I can't, in this day and age. There's always two sides to the story, and what the court wanted this board to do is focus on the words of the code and not deal with questions about what is the proper policy, is this place properly cited? This is already looked at by the planning board in 7-zip. They said this is the right place for it. And the court just wants you to say whether the building department and the chief code enforcement officer made a mistake or not. We don't think they did. And we asked this board, respectfully, to deny the appeals and to affirm the determinations that this in fact is a permissive use in the large lot district, and that the bulk requirements in the R3 district as it applies to lot coverage in fact do not apply. Questions?
Mr. Rosenbaum, I think that it would be helpful to the board, at least from your side of the ledger, to take a moment and go through those three examples.
Yes, I will.
That are in your June 4th letter.
Yep.
Which demonstrate what your point is.
So the point I believe that Mr. DeMarco is asking me about is to compare how the bulk requirements in the large lot district in which this use is going to be located differ from what I believe are the inapplicable or irrelevant bulk requirements in the R3 district, which again, based on Mr. Tantillo's argument, would necessarily, you'd have to overrule, in effect, the bulk requirements of the large lot district and transport the R3 bulk requirements on a wholesale basis into that, just because it's a farm. And if you look at page 3 of my June 4th letter, which is one of the handouts, I've shown how the inconsistencies that are readily apparent in Mr. Tantillo's argument, because this can't possibly be what the code means. The first item, and they're numbered 1, 2, 3 on page 3, and I'll wait till the board members get to that point. But number 1, in the large lot district, 225-12B2 mandates a minimum lot width of 200 feet in the large lot district as compared to 225-11B3 that mandates a minimum lot width of 100 feet in the R3 district. So again, Mr. Tantillo says if you're going to have a farm in a large lot district, and I think that's only one of 2 districts where farms are expressly permitted, you can have as little as 100 feet minimum lot width. Now does that make any sense to anybody? To have 100 feet minimum lot width in a large lot district? Well, that's what Mr. Tantillo's argument would lead you to that point, if you take it to its logical conclusion. The second point is, let's compare section 225-12B1, which is a minimum lot area of 3 acres for residential use and 5 acres for non-residential use in a large lot district. And a farm, of course, would be a non-residential use. Compare that with 225-11B1A for the R3 district, where a residential has to have 22,000 square feet for residential, which is roughly, what, a half acre? Mr. Hauser?
Yep,
I don't know.
approximately.
Okay. You'd have half acre and 2 acres for non-residential in the R3 district. So applying Mr. Tantillo's logic, you'd actually be able to have a smaller lot in the large lot district if this was an agricultural use, according to Mr. Tantillo. And then number 3, and again, I've just picked these out because I think you might be able to come up with even more inconsistencies, and there are many more. But the third one is 225-12B4. In the large lot district, you need a minimum front setback of 75 and rear setback of 60 feet, compared with the R3 district 225-11B5A, where you had a minimum front setback of a mere 50 feet and a rear setback of 50 feet. So, again, it makes no sense. But what Mr. Tantillo would like you to do, he's going to cherry pick the one he wants to apply. And he says, well, let's use the 20% maximum lot coverage because that's the one he likes. And that's the one his client likes because we have a 38% coverage, and that's something that the planning board approved. So I think you'll see that we're talking about reading the plain language of the code, coming to logical conclusions about what it says, without having to divine whether this is a good thing or a bad thing for the town of Webster from a policy standpoint, which of course is not what we're here to do. So, again, I think the board, after it gives some consideration and thought, will very easily come to the conclusion that your building department and your chief code enforcement officer had it right. That's my presentation, unless you've got some questions.
I got a question. So, why do you say that the chief code enforcement officer had it right when he said that this was an agricultural use permitted rather than a factory farming operation?
Why do I think he had it right? Because
Yes.
I'm reading the code, and I read the code the same way, presumably, that the chief code enforcement officer did.
One of the notes I read from the judge that sent it back to the zoning board is that there's no record that the chief zoning or the chief enforcement officer, code enforcement, made that determination. They implied that the planning board made that interpretation, which is not appropriate.
No, I think,
And unfortunately, we don't have minutes from the PRC meeting, but I think that's one of their contentions.
so,
is
Mr.
that-
Barone, let me explain what I think your concern, let me rephrase what I think your concern is. Judge Donofrio concluded that there necessarily had to be some findings made by the Department of Public Works or the Chief Code Enforcement Officer, or it would never have been able to get to the planning board. Because the Public Works Department reviews the applications, and they make a preliminary determination of whether or not this fits all the requirements for permitted use in the code, and whether or not it fits the necessary bulk requirements. And if it does, it's going to tell the applicant, you need a variance. Go to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So that's what I believe, and that's why, if you read Judge Donofrio's decision, as I have too many times already, unfortunately, Judge Donofrio is saying what I think is obvious to everybody. Somebody must have made a determination in the Department of Public Works, or it never would have gotten to the planning board. So that's when I say that affirm the finding of the Chief Code Enforcement Officer and or the Department of Public Works. I'm saying somebody in that department made that determination, or it never would have gotten to the planning board. And we're asking you to affirm whatever that determination was, and that's what I meant to say. Perhaps I said it not very well, but that's what I meant.
No, I understand. I've been doing up PRC meetings to know the discussions that go on and so on, and so there's quite lengthy discussions
Yeah.
about that. So I'm not saying I doubt that it happened. I'm just saying that's one of the judge's implications.
Yes, I think the judge is making an assumption that it would never have gotten to the planning board unless somebody at the Department of Public Works had reviewed this for zoning compliance purposes.
You made a comment that Mr. Tantillo wanted the board to disregard a couple words
Yes.
from, I think, 225-11. What were those words again? Can you say?
Yes. The words that the words that I said Mr. Tantillo would like the board to ignore are actually in 225-73.
Now, see, 225-73, you actually made the statement that you thought it was irrelevant, that section.
Well, I did, and I made the argument in the alternative, Mr. Donato. Okay? So in other words, I'm representing the developer, I have to...
Well, I'm just trying to make, so I want to focus on you, Mr. Tantillo, you made a comment that that he wanted this board to ignore a couple words.
Yes.
But you made a statement earlier that said 225-73 agricultural uses was an irrelevant section of the code. Could you explain that?
Yes.
Okay.
I made the argument in the alternative. In other words, when you think you've got a winning argument, and you have two different arguments, both of which are winning, you're gonna argue both of those arguments. I'm sorry.
Oh, microphone.
When you have a winning argument, you're gonna cover all your bases. What I'm saying is that 225-73 deals with an accessory use, because it says 225-73 that agricultural uses are permitted in all districts. So we don't have to rely on 225-73 for a permitted agricultural use in the large lot district, because unlike,
But it says customary agriculture operation. So
that's 225-73, yes.
73.
Yes. And what I-
Customary.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
customary, according to the Webster's, is according to customary or usual practices associated with a particular society, place, or set of circumstances.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is a different use of, I mean, you're growing lettuce, but it's not your typical, I mean, anybody that I said, hey, what does a farm mean to you? They're not going to describe what you're talking about right now. That's not customary. So, I mean, it's a big word that you said is irrelevant. To me, customary, there's a reason and a purpose why that word was put there.
Okay, so Mr. Donato, I completely understand your concern, and I want to address it. Number one, 225-73 deals with an accessory use. Is an agricultural use an accessory use in the large lot district? No, it's an expressly permitted use. Okay, number two, but even if this were an accessory use, even if it had to be an accessory use in order to have a farm in the large lot district, what does 225-73 mean? Now, you're focusing on the customary farming operation. And the only thing I can say is that you don't define that in the code. The code of the town of Webster doesn't define customary.
I know, but it does list a few things that were added. Permitted uses shall be, they actually added fire stations and emergency medical services in 2014. They also added communications towers in 2000 and, where is that? In 1996, primarily because I don't think communication towers were a big problem or a concern prior to 1996, and they had to amend Section 225-11 in order to accommodate communication tower, and they had to amend 225-11 to accommodate fire stations and emergency medical. Personally, I think that the whole thing is the interpretation of what your definition of agricultural is.
Well, we know the code talks about the greenhouses. If you look at 225 section 3, which contains the definitions of your code, it says agricultural use includes greenhouses. We've got greenhouses. Where do you draw the line? Is one greenhouse okay? Is one greenhouse customary? Is two greenhouses customary? At what point is it no longer customary? And if the code doesn't define it, then you're making it up. You've got to make it up as you go along. And with all due respect to the board, you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't just make it up as you go along. If it's not in the code, it's not a restriction. Mr. Goldman, did you have something you want to? Mr. DeMarco and Mr. Chairman, can I allow Mr.
Of course, but before you leave, Mr. Rosenbaum,
Yeah.
you keep using the word accessory use, that you don't get that far in your analysis. Where are you picking that up, accessory use?
Well, I believe that, if I can find the section here, hold on.
As I read, it says supplementary regulations. It's how we land at 22573, I believe.
Yes, it's a supplementary regulation, and
That
really,
applies to all
Article
districts.
and really, you've got to decide how 22573 fits, if at all, in a large lot district. And what I'm talking about is item number F, Mr. Denoto. It says customary agricultural operations or farming may be conducted in all zones. And that's really what I'm referring to as an accessory use, because this allows you to have a customary agriculture use in the R1 district, an R2 district, the industrial district, any district. And when you do, these provisions of 22573 apply. And what I'm doing is comparing that to the large lot district, where you don't need to resort to 22573 in order to supply the bulk requirements for the large lot district, because they're already in there, because an agricultural use is an expressly permitted use in the large lot district. So, again, what's customary to me may be something that's completely not customary to Mr. DeMarco or Mr. Goldman. But where do you draw the line? The code doesn't define it.
That would be why this is to the board for an interpretation.
That's
And
true.
when you say that what's customary, at the corner of Whiting and Clem Road, there's been a greenhouse operation that's been there for at least 70 years. These are small, maybe 12-foot high at the peak greenhouses. There's 4 of them. They're not large at all. You could fit 2 of them into this room. The farmer at that point in history, when it was being farmed, lived on the property. They still farm some peaches there, limited numbers. Would you please compare that to what you're talking about, which is essentially large factory buildings with no farmer in residence, and explain how that is a customary farm use?
Again, Mr. Schneider, I'm not sure that we need to rely on the customary language, but your question is important to you, so I'm going to answer it. Mr. Schneider, I don't know where you draw the line. And that's the problem with the code. It doesn't tell the people who own land what they can and cannot do. And if it doesn't tell the people what they can and cannot do, then it can't be construed in a way that would prohibit them from doing what they plan to do. There's got to be definition. There's got to be certainty. And this code doesn't provide that. What I'm saying, that if we came up with a definition that has no foundation in the code, we would be acting in an arbitrary manner. And I don't think that's what the board wants to do. I think the board wants to adhere to what the code says. So because you have no definition for customary, and again, let's assume that definition applies to the large lot district, then I think we've got a problem. The board has a problem with importing into the code something that doesn't exist. So, again, I understand what is and what is not a big farming operation and what is a small farming operation. And if the code were to say the customary use is defined as not more than X acres, or not more than so many square feet of greenhouses, that would be fine. But that's not what the code says. It leaves it for guesswork as to what landowners are supposed to believe they can and cannot do on their property. And they leave it to people, board members, to divine what that might be. And I respectfully suggest that's not what the board's role is here. Now, I completely respect the difficulty in making this decision. And I know there's a lot of interest and emotion involved in this, and I know there's many, many people in the town that are opposed to this project. But if that were the simple role of the board, just do a poll of how many people are opposed to a project, then there would be no reason to have this board in place. You would just take a poll and who likes it, who doesn't like it, and whoever has the greatest head count wins. That's not the way to do land planning, right? I think we can all agree on that. Mr. Goldman, do you want to add something?
Please.
I don't know how we deal with the microphones.
You have to go to,
Mr. Rosenbaum has to exit and you have to step up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Jerry Goldman. I'm an attorney and agent also for CEA Fresh Farms. I'd like to address Mr. Denoto's comment, Mr. Schneider's comment about how we deal with customary. The fact of the matter is that this is pretty simple if we follow along the lines. In the large lot district, agriculture is a specifically permitted use. Agriculture is defined in 225.3, and that definition we've gone through dealing with the growing of crops in greenhouses. So that is that's permitted. It's the use of land and buildings to grow agricultural products in otherwise and in greenhouses. The 225.73 section came in later. 225.73 came in, I believe, as a part of the state's effort to try to encourage right to farm. So that caused the town to go and to add a section to allow agriculture in all districts. For those districts in which it's not an enumerated use, industrial, commercial, some of the other smaller residential, for those types of sections, those types of zoning districts, then 225.73's language on customary kicks in. In the areas where it is specifically permitted, you go to the code definition of what is agriculture. So you don't, in a large lot district, you do not get to customary. So that is the basic issue of the permitted use. The second piece of it...
Mr. Goldman, let me just interrupt you there. So, because it looks like that was added in 2010.
Yeah.
All right? So, I mean, is it fair to suggest that if they wanted to take the word customary and put it into the large lot code section, that they would have qualified agriculture there?
They could have done a couple of things. Could have changed the definition of agriculture. They could have changed the large lot district to say customary agriculture. They could have done lots of things, but they didn't. What they did is that they left the agriculture in the districts where agriculture was allowed. And large lot makes sense for agriculture. Now, again, you can argue about the greenhouses. Mr. Schneider, we've been at it for a long time dealing with this kind of stuff, but you can talk about greenhouses, but again, we don't define the size, the magnitude of what greenhouses are. The hydroponic growing that we're doing here has been done on this scale elsewhere. It's coming here. The code hasn't necessarily caught up with it right now, but we have to take the code as it is written right now. And as it is written, agriculture is defined as the growing of farm products in land and buildings and in greenhouses. If we were in a commercial district or an industrial district, which doesn't have it specifically defined, then we come into the customary. But the customary only applies in those districts where it is not a specifically permitted use. It's pretty fundamental by the language. And I know, and, you know, we know the dynamics of what's going on. We know that that people don't necessarily like it in the immediate neighborhood. People in other parts of town don't necessarily like it either. But there are lots of people who are looking forward to seeing leafy green lettuce being available 12 months a year in Monroe County. And the fact of the matter is, this is a permitted use, and this is a district in which the code allows it. Just to point out, and Mr. Young's presentation was very good. It was one which was also made to the planning board. But notice what it says on the first page. It talks about it being inappropriate. He didn't talk about it being illegal. He didn't talk about it being contrary to code. He says there are lots of reasons why we don't want this in our neighborhood. That's not the standard that we're looking at. The standard that we are looking at is exactly reading the code, reading the language, matching up the sections from one, matching up the sections to the other. Now, as to the 22573D issue that we have talked about, I think it's been pointed out on a number of occasions. If you took those words out, as to single-family dwellings, then all of R3 would apply. What meaning does it have to put as to single-family dwellings? It's meant to say we don't want row houses, we don't want multiple dwellings for farm laborers, we don't want any of those types of uses in this particular district. We don't have standards dealing with building height, for example. So we put a building height in there, which is in the R3 district. We talk about minimum habitable area, what size of the units have to be. And that's why it doesn't say the residential districts, because it applies the R3 standards, which are specific. Basically, the difference between R1, R2, and R3 are bulk requirements, including the size of the buildings themselves. So the language, if we ignore that language, then it becomes superfluous, and what's it doing there? And that's basically what the courts have said, is that if there are words in the code, they mean something. Now, the absence, if you don't take those words into account, then there's a gap in there. And that's basically the sum of the argument.
Occam's razor, then.
I'm sorry?
Occam's razor, then.
And
Occam's razor?
Don't
If
know-
there are
not familiar with Occam's razor.
if there are two interpretations, then the simplest is probably the correct one.
Yep, it is. It is. And the fact of the matter is that the simplest one in terms of permitted use is that agriculture is permitted. Here's the definition of agriculture. Boom, simple. When you got to stretch to try to get to another section which talks about customary, then you're on the other side of the razor, I guess, if that's the appropriate term to use. But the thing is that why would those words be there? They had to be there for a reason. And the reason was it's to deal with the houses, not to deal with other requirements. That's as simple as it gets.
Now, within the definition of agricultural use, within the
Yes.
definition, it actually refers to section 225-73.
It says see that section, and that was
So
to
do I
take a look at.
discount that section, or is that part of the definition by nature of the fact
No,
that
it's
it's
not part of
listed
the
there?
definition, because it doesn't say implying anything else other than what is there. What it's saying is that agricultural uses, you have to take a look at 22573, but you don't necessarily change what the definition of agriculture is. It's saying there are other requirements you have to take a look at. And that deals with the houses, deals with as it relates to single-family dwellings.
that you have to take a look at.
Any other
I'm sorry,
questions?
did I get your, the answer to your question?
No, I'm still,
He forgot what it was.
I remember what it was. Part of your argument is that this is an agricultural project. Yes.
all right? But clearly, in the code, it says customary.
No.
It says right here,
It
that says customary agricultural operations or farming. It
It's
says
allowed in
it,
all districts. Customary is allowed in all districts.
I'm just-
Agriculture as defined is allowed in the large
but
lot
it,
district.
it's only dealing with agricultural. That says customary agricultural operations or farming.
Then
Is that
why-
talking about, it's not talking about residences, it's not talking about anything else. It's talking about customary agricultural operations or farming.
But then let me ask you this. Why don't we eliminate the definition of agricultural in the definition?
I can't answer that question because I didn't write the code. I'm only.
Right, and it's there because,
But in order to address the problem that we're talking about right now, in the past, they've added things to make it clear. They added fire stations, emergency medical services, because it didn't exist prior to 2014. Somebody came before the board and wanted to build a fire station and a medical service in an R3 district, okay? Somebody wanted to erect a communications tower. Prior to 1996, it didn't address it. Somebody came here and made an argument. They added that. Now, I'm just saying that you're, from my perspective, what you're describing and what I know you're gonna build, because I've seen the farm off of 104, okay? Is stretching the interpretation of what a customary agricultural development is for me.
But Mr. Donato, what the applicant, or what CEA is trying to say is that under their interpretation, you don't reach that customary
Under their interpretation,
decision.
right? It's under their interpretation, though.
Right, but you understand that's a distinction, you never get there if you adopt their reasoning of the chronology of the statute and what's allowed in the large lot district.
Okay. I understand.
the customary was added, but it was added to include it in all the other districts. As I recall, and I may be wrong about this, I think the origin of this was every 7 years or so, they review an agricultural plan. And there was a criticism in an agricultural plan that Webster was too restrictive in terms of the districts which included agriculture. So the town board in their wisdom went and they added this particular section. Now, as you pointed out, people were concerned about communications towers. People were concerned about fire stations. They didn't come here because the zoning board doesn't write the law. The zoning board interprets the law that's set forth. They went to the town board and they got that amended to allow it to happen. In the same way, someone could go and try to amend a code, but the fact of the matter is, we're here tonight taking a look at a code that says in the large lot district, agriculture is permitted, agriculture is defined in the code, we meet the definition. That's the end of that issue, or should be.
So prior to 2014, they didn't allow agriculture in an industrial district, for instance.
Correct.
Ironically, the citizens are saying it's an industrial operation, and it wasn't even allowed in an industrial
Yeah,
district.
I mean, the thing that we had heard is move it to Xerox, you know, and put it at Xerox. Well, the fact of the matter is that prior to the amendment to bring in this 22573, I don't think it was allowed in the industrial district. So, yeah, that's really the issue. What this was meant to do was to correct a gap. And sometimes correcting a gap
creates a bit of a problem because they have a term that's not defined. We put customary agricultural operations out there, should be defined. What's customary?
Eric, you brought up the Lockyer Farm on 5 Mile Line Road and Whiting Road. There were numerous greenhouses on that parcel prior to the subdivision there.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And from what I recall, they couldn't have possibly met the acreage or coverage requirement. There again, it's all depending on, unfortunately, I go back too far. And I could possibly cloud the issue. I think the ag use was in the code back in the 60s, 68. I don't,
Well, we'd have
Jeff,
to
do you
ask
have the
Leo
code book,
about
the old
that.
code book?
The old one?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're still in the office.
No, do you have it here?
No, I don't.
There again, that's what I'm recalling. And there again, to cloud the issue even further, if you look at the accessory buildings, farm operations are basically excluded from any type of provisions from accessory buildings. And that's under section 22536. And that's why earlier when I stated that provision 22573D dealt with single-family residential units. Somebody indicated you could just delete that. I mean, that's what they're trying to establish in that section for migrant workers or tenants, or people that have worked on the farm. They were trying to establish that those units would have some land that would be associated with those units, rather than have the old traditional row houses for migrant workers. There again, my opinion.
So the code is trying to maintain a quality of the additional houses on the property?
That's correct, yes. There again, that's my opinion. There again, the town code always try to provide some flexibility for farms, and that's why when they even dealt with accessory buildings, they excluded any type of provisions for building accessory buildings on farms. And that's under 22536D. In case anybody wants to look that up. I mean, yes, in the section prior to that, it said agricultural buildings would be no higher than 20 feet, but then the very last subsection of that says farms don't have to comply with it. So, but the code always dealt with some flexibility for farms.
One other thing, I mean, we've talked about this in the leafy greens and the agriculture and the greenhouses and everything else. You take dairy farms. A lot of dairy farms, we talk about these percentage coverage situations. A lot of dairy farms have a lot greater than 20% building coverage because they have to have buildings and structures to deal with the farm animals, to deal with the cows. So it's not unusual always to have relatively large structures in conjunction with farm agriculture, if you will, type uses. So, you know, it's just we're dealing with greenhouses now as a vehicle to be able to grow. And like I said, the end result is something I think is going to be beneficial at the end of the day for everyone to be able to get these vegetables locally grown. Don't have to worry about E. coli in California. You know, it's all controlled and everything else. So that's really what's happening now in terms of agriculture.
Any other question?
How does the use in question fit with the large lot code that is intended to encourage large lot residential development where conditions of the environment, availability of utilities, surrounding land use patterns dictate that residential densities and the amount of land covered by impervious surface remain low. You're covering roughly 50% of the acreage with impervious surface. Is that considered low coverage?
Well, yeah, I'm not gonna say this is low coverage. You know I'm not gonna say that, because that's not the case.
So it exactly
But
contradicts the,
What you're reading is the preamble. You're not reading the actual section of what
But that
is
was
a
the-
permitted use and what isn't. You
that
can
was
talk
the
about a
intent of
purpose
the
clause.
code, though.
You can talk about a purpose clause, but it also talks about those coverage issues as it deals with the residential as well. So, the fact of the matter is, it doesn't really specifically address, that purpose clause doesn't specifically address what we're talking about. I'm trying to look up 22573, or 22512.
225.12, right.
Let's go to 12. Let's go to 12.
And then is,
And my eyes are good enough to even read this, it's all right.
Mine aren't.
It's all right. So the intent of the article is to encourage large lot residential development. Now, granted, and that's what it says, is to encourage large lot residential development. But it specifically does allow the agricultural use, so
Yes.
it's inconsistent with that purpose to start with, by definition and by what the code says.
well, is it if
It talks about residential densities and the amount of land covered by impervious surface. So, to my mind, the way I take a look at that is as talking about impervious surface as it deals with residential densities. And the fact of the matter is that the large lot district does restrict because of the size of the district, and I know members of the board live in the large lot district. You can't have a whole lot of residential density in the large lot district. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think that clustering is allowed even in the large lot district.
no, it's not.
No.
It's not. So to that extent, it doesn't allow for residential densities, and that is how the code addresses the issue. But the purpose clause itself is a preamble, and it's pretty much setting up what is in the code. And what it's saying is, for residential uses, we don't want them to be dense. It's not saying for agricultural uses, it's not saying for other uses that are permitted in that district. It's purely a purpose clause, which is essentially a preamble.
I think it goes back to the cows example. I could stick a dairy farm on that property and put in 2 very large barns, fill them with dairy cows. It's a traditional farming operation. I could have the same amount of impermeable surface, and it's still permitted because it's an agricultural use.
You folks have another speaker?
I'm all set. I was just going to clarify a couple of points. I don't know, is there anybody else? I think we're all set in terms of our presentation on this. If there are no more questions, I'll put my mask on and sit down.
Yeah,
Or leave.
I think
Or
we're
go
gonna,
outside.
we're gonna ask the other group if they want to rebut, and then if you folks want to
we take a
rebut as well,
recess?
you're welcome to stick around. Right.
Mr. Burrow, maybe take a recess for 5 minutes?
Yeah, we've been here for 2.5 hours. Actually, we've been here more. We get here early today. So let's take a little recess for the board, and we'll resume in about 10 minutes. Yep. We've had some comment via Facebook or email or Webster webpage, and actually Mr. Artuso is going to read comment. This meeting is open to public comment. We're going to open the phone lines up in a moment also. But Josh, you want to read what you have?
Sure. This first comment is from Elizabeth Wager Stenslick. She says, I live at 828 Bannerwood Drive in Webster. We are greatly opposed to the CEA Fresh Farm project. I have attached a picture taken in my backyard on 12/28/19. This is the glow of the Inner Grow factory located 2 miles from my home. The CEA project is even closer to my home. We are highly concerned by the increased levels of noise, light, and traffic this project would bring to our neighborhood. Second comment from Jennifer Brunig. She states that she lives across from the proposed development at 1804 State Road. She would like to state that she is in opposition to the development. Now we have another comment from a Jim Brunig, also residing at 1804 State Road. Please note the word of in 225-73. Single dwelling units of R3 shall apply. If this were only applicable to single dwelling units with agricultural use, then the word of is not required. We must treat every word as important. Second comment from Jim Brunig, also 1804 State Road. One last item. Of indicates that single-family dwelling is a clarifier for R3. It is not saying that R3 only applies to single-family dwellings. We have an additional comment from Jennifer Brunig, also at 1804 State Road. She says, may I add to my comment that the zoning board please look at the intent of our LL large lot district. Thank you. Okay, and one final comment from Jim Brunig. Please add that the preamble discussion of intent in the large lot section of the code provides a framework to interpret the code. This is useful in interpreting items like customary or R3, the 20% lot coverage. Contrary to the CEA position, the zoning board is to interpret the code. Also, the math presented by CEA and Mr. Schneider is incorrect. Dairy farms typically do not exceed 10% lot coverage. There is no basis to the contrary. And that sums up the online comments.
Okay. I'm going to open up the phone lines. This meeting is open to the public, so anybody wishing to speak for or against this project is welcome to call in, and we'll hear what you have to say. Okay. And then the citizens group is going to rebut what CEA's presentation had to say, and then we'll give the council for CEA another chance as well. It's important that we want to hear everybody's voice before we even begin to make a decision. Yeah.
Council?
No calls yet. Why don't you step up and if the phone rings, I may interrupt you. Okay.
You'll have to all forgive me. Usually I get up for these rebuttals and I say I just have a few brief points, but I actually do have quite a bit based on what Jerry and Warren said. I have quite a few problems with their arguments. First of all, I want to address something that came really out of left field. The suggestion that 225-73 only deals with accessory uses. I want to be very clear that that's not the impression that anyone leaves here with tonight. That article of the zoning code is titled, Jerry Warren said, supplemental regulations. He left out the last few words. Supplemental regulations for all districts. So it lists a bunch of different uses, and then if you're happening to build a project that's one of those uses, you have to comply with the supplemental regulations for that use. So if you were building a bed and breakfast, you have to comply with section 71. If you were doing off-street parking, you comply with 72. If you're doing agricultural uses, you comply with 73. It's in addition to the individual regulations from each distinct district. The suggestion was that you don't need to get to 73 because it's a permitted use in the large lot zoning district. I think he left off a chain in the logical link there. So if you look at LL, the permitted uses, it includes agricultural uses. Then if you go to definitions for what an agricultural use is, it refers you to 225-73. So normally, we talked about how subsections work with these codes. When a code section refers you to another section, it's generally incorporating that section as well. So those regulations are incorporated into the definition of agricultural use. I want to talk about what Mr. Rosenbaum, characterized Judge Donofrio's decision as. He suggested that Judge Donofrio somehow held that code review for this project necessarily occurred, and that's not what the judge said. What the judge said was, we're going to annul this planning board approval because one of two things happened. Either review for this project occurred and the ZBA appeal was screened from you guys, or review for the project didn't occur. The judge in no way said that the code enforcement officer found that this project was a permitted use. That is nowhere in her decision, and I hope you guys will have a copy. If not, I can provide it. I was accused of cherry picking a particular dimensional restriction, and I think that accusation kind of comes from a misunderstanding of how bulk and dimensional restrictions apply to uses under a zoning code. So I referred initially to a series of non sequiturs that were in the developer's letter, and this is what I was talking about, this list of certain dimensional restrictions and how if you apply them under my interpretation, they don't make any sense. But it's not really borne out by that reading. Like he says, oh, the minimum lot size would change. We're okay with that. What that says is that small farms are allowed under this interpretation. It doesn't say anything else. So when you go through this list of dimensional restrictions that apply to an agricultural use, and you check and see that it complies with every single one of them, and you find one that it doesn't apply with, or apply to, or that it doesn't comply with, that's not cherry picking. That's how zoning works. You have to comply with all of them. So to point out that you don't meet the maximum lot coverage is not cherry picking maximum lot coverage. They don't get to pick and choose which ones they have to comply with. They have to comply with each and every dimensional restriction, one of which is lot coverage. So I really just wanted to dispel any notion that we're cherry picking at all and bringing that to you guys' attention. I discussed with you guys how the use of the words single-family residents weren't superfluous. Jerry again just accused me of, Mr. Goldman again accused us of offering a interpretation that was calling for superfluous words. That's where that distinction about like the zoning district buffer comes in. Under that, do you guys understand what I'm saying about that one? That's a little bit technical. He's saying that when they refer to, as applies to single-family residences in an R3 district, it would be superfluous to not apply the single-family residence portion of the language. But say that this property was on a zoning district buffer, right? And you guys have that portion in your code that says where two districts abut and one district is residential, commercial use has to have a larger buffer from that district than a residential use, right? What this code is saying when it says apply the restrictions as they would apply to a residential use, for instance, here it's saying you wouldn't have to go outside that buffer. You could put it where you could put a residential use. That's just one example of how that language is not superfluous. I truly hope that none of you guys will credit the assertion that the language in the large lot residential zoning district provision calling for low impervious surfaces only applies to residential. There's absolutely nothing to support that interpretation. And it's contrary to the reason that interpretation or that language is there. It's an environmental issue. It's for the quality of the neighborhood as a whole. And saying that only residential uses have to comply with this low impervious surface, it just flies in the face of the district. Finally, I picked up on something Jerry said. The code hasn't caught up with it yet. And I think what he did there was, he might have said the quiet part out loud. We think that CEA is here because they think they've found a loophole in your zoning code. You know, Mr. Rosenbaum discussed how it's not tenable to draw a line as to what customary agriculture is. That's why you guys are here. You guys are that line. So when Mr. Goldman comes in and he says, oh, we don't think your goat is caught up with this use, so we're going to try to get it in really quick before you can fix it. That's why the zoning board exists. It's to address things that maybe aren't as black and white as that. So you guys are here to apply the word customary to say, hey, this isn't what they had in mind when they said this is what is permitted in this district. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that the phone number is showing up on your screens at home. I can't confirm, but our number is 872-7011. 872-7011. It is showing up? Okay, thank you. I was just concerned because the phone wasn't ringing. Okay.
Good point.
Yep, sorry. No. Yeah. Okay. Anybody have any questions? I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I would just say, I heard you mention that you're going to offer a rebuttal opportunity to the developer. I think just because it is our appeal, if we might have anything to add after that, I just ask for the opportunity.
Does anybody else from your group want to speak? No. Okay. All right, thank you very much. Got to clean the podium one more time. Okay.
In our code? No.
Just to be quick, we don't have any sort of rebuttal on this.
So we'll stand with what we have presented previously. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Goldman? No. Okay. I want to thank both parties for the very professional manner in which they handled themselves, and I appreciate the comments that came in. This is such a contentious issue that we wanted to be sure everybody's heard. It's very important to us. All right. You all have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you closing the public portion?
No phone calls, correct?
We haven't had a call.
Okay,
No.
so you're closing the public portion?
Yeah, at this point, what we'll do is we'll close, as long as these folks have nothing more to add. The phone hasn't rang. Josh read the comments that came in online. We're going to close the public portion of the meeting. We'll turn it back to the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. There's a lot of data here, so I don't believe we're going to vote on this tonight. And according to our charge, I believe we don't want to drag this out 60 days. We're going to act on it in the very, very near future. But there was a lot of information here tonight, so we need a little bit of time to discuss it amongst ourselves. You're welcome to stay, of course. Okay. This is, how do you lawyers do this every day?
Lots of
You think?
right? We get old before our time.
No, he's looking pretty good for 73.
I thought so too.
Yeah, I mean, they're both compelling arguments on both sides, and I just, I mean, we're arguing about a word, a word here and a word there, and so on and so forth. I have a different, after listening to both sides, I have some different perspectives, so I need time to think about it. I need time to go back to the code book, look at the sections again, read it again, and, and see. See where it leads me. I don't know if you all feel the same way, but we're welcome. We could discuss this right now amongst each other. It's it's a public,
Maybe a
public
little bit
hearing.
of discussion, because I am having some trouble parsing it all.
Yeah, there's a lot to this. There's a lot to this.
I mean, by the absolute verbal description, if you take it down that one particular path, then the code allows agriculture in a large lot, and greenhouse is agriculture, and so therefore, it's just like the dominoes going down. Now, does, on the other hand, this section pull in the definition of customary and things like that? Does it only apply to R3? Does it apply to all districts? I haven't made up my mind yet. Factory farming in and of itself, with such large buildings on such a small area, would seem to be something we would rather have in an industrial zone. It's certainly going to have an impact on the existing residents and the future development as large lot residential, because people, quite plain and frankly, aren't going to want to live next to a factory. We had that problem with Studco, and I've forgotten the subdivision's name, Corinne, maybe?
Yeah,
Yeah,
over in that
Shallow Creek.
Bolter Industrial.
Shallow Creek,
Yeah.
that's it, because Karen and I were actually looking for property at that point, and she says, well, why don't we look in here? And I said, absolutely not, because it butts right up on an industrial zone. And sure enough, they built Shallow Creek, and Studco was busy, doing their industrial thing in their industrial zone, and the noise carried, and the neighbors weren't happy. So there's a lot going on here. I have to agree with Mr. Barone on that one.
Yeah, one of the things, and I'm just throwing out ideas. This is not I haven't made any decisions. One of the things that impressed me is that the 100 acres north of Xerox used to be zoned industrial.
Mm-hmm.
There's residential all around it, R3.
Oh, yeah.
So one argument is, well, it belongs in industrial, but here's this industrial building in full view of R3 houses, which are high density.
Yeah.
Relatively high density. So, I've been a lifelong resident of Webster, so I know what's changed in the town and what's happened and so on and so forth. So I'm churning these things over in my mind, trying to come up with a logical conclusion, and there's a lot to it. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, and I keep looking at it as, I went back to my old notes of the James Kuhn Zoning Board of Appeals technical publications regarding interpretations, because we keep arguing over the definitions. And under the interpretation section, it says if the definition is not clearly noted in your code, you can use such things as the dictionary. I think the supplemental section, since it's included in the definition of agriculture, needs to be considered. I keep coming back to that definition of customary. And if I pull out my Merriam-Webster dictionary, customary is commonly practiced, used, or observed, and then, or based on established by custom or customary laws. And agriculture is the art, science, or practicing of cultivating the soil, producing crops, and raising livestock, and varying degree of preparation and marketing of resulting products. Cultivating the soil, do I consider this a soil cultivating agriculture operation, or do I consider this a factory that produces a product and the product just happens to be, in this case, leafy greens? But it could be widgets, it could be boxes, it could be...
Well, hydroponics in definition is without soil.
But our code doesn't address the hydroponics, and this isn't just the greenhouses. There's, I think it was 75 thousand square feet of processing facility in addition. So I'm growing it, but then I've got a factory, and I've got a loading dock, and I've got the 40 truckloads that are gonna come in per days. There's a lot of definition that the board needs to take into account. What was the intent of the code? The large lot was added to the code after we moved to Webster, and for the reasons to protect a section of town that was fairly undeveloped, that didn't have the infrastructure.
Actually, I was on the.
Because I was R3 when I bought my property, and then it changed.
The main reason the board established large lot, which I did not agree to, by the way, was because it was an area that was not easily sewered.
Right.
That was the principal reason, because the following master plan, they expanded the large lot area to include the northern portion which you reside in.
Right.
Whiting Road. And that just butchers zoning.
But you
Because
know,
it's so difficult to revert back to anything in the future once you establish that large parcel. And people that reside there in the future, they're gonna want to sell portions of their property, which doesn't permit it.
right.
I mean, town of Mendon went through that a number of years ago, about 15 years ago. They had 5 acres, and the town board was petitioned to allow smaller parcels off theirs, off their 5-acre parcels.
Well, part of that was, with the evolution of the EPA, the DEC, septic systems fell out of favor. So areas, like you said, that were not easily sewered, the large lots would ensure that the septic systems
That's right.
were plenty far apart.
Right.
To do half-acre lots with septic systems was just unacceptable.
Then we have
I found it in Circle Lane, I said, I can't believe there's not sewers here. You know?
Yeah.
But I think that was the, and actually, the town board has the option, if a builder could provide sewers to an area, the town board could take it out.
Well, that was the carrot in the initial ordinance,
Yeah.
but then it was removed because there was such a determination to stop development.
That was another fad we went through.
Right.
Or phase we
Stop
went
all
through.
development. Okay?
Yeah, we've been through
So they
that.
removed that carrot where the town board had the option, if sewers were able to service that area, they could revert back to, I believe it was R2 zone.
So,
Let me just add from Ms. Vullo's comments that, you know, you have to make a determination before you just simply adopt 22573F as expansively as you indicated. You have to make a determination that is part and parcel of the definition that's contained in 220, in the large lot definition, because it appears as though, based upon when that was written and the language, the context that it's set forth in, that might not be an automatic thing to do. It says customary agricultural operations or farming may be conducted in all zones, which is significantly different than the context of the permitted use under the large lot section. One could argue that by looking at that, it's allowing the qualifier, customary, which is undefined, but intentionally doing that in areas where it wasn't previously permitted.
So that would allow agricultural in a commercial or an industrial or an outdoor storage area where it might not be specifically listed as an allowable use.
Because
I don't have my code book in front of me.
I think the difficulty is that in the time frame and the manner and the location where they put that language, it seems as though it would be a reasonable inference to say if they wanted to qualify agricultural uses in the large lot area, they would have done so.
But yet they refer to that in the actual
Well,
definition of
they
agriculture.
bracket it in terms of another location where agriculture is defined. But it's in the context of in all zones. I think it's a significant distinction.
I think the chronology, this helped a lot. It happened in 2014. The large lot zoning was written long before that.
Right, that was
So this was added, and I
1996, I think.
think that's important to know that this was an added.
2003?
93.
Yeah, it was in the 90s.
Because my wife wanted to move to Whiting Road for a long time, and it basically said, no, absolutely not, because if the Hale and Gosnell property goes on the market, it could end up being, we'll have 7 acres of land, and we're staring at an R3
600 houses across the street.
development across the street. And so when in 93 that all changed,
You better hit
I
Barry?
said, that said, okay, fine, good, then we're protected. So,
The other issue is there's a natural tendency to start talking about intent, which the board is only allowed to do when it's ambiguous. If it's not ambiguous, it has to be given its strictest definition. And it's challenging, obviously, as we've all determined, under the large lot, when it just says agricultural uses, period, there's not much ambiguity there.
But do we ignore the preamble that says that looking for the
Right, so-
low percentage of impervious area,
So
where this is just paved?
the preamble certainly, at best, doesn't carry anywhere near the weight, I should say, as the actual definitions of the statute that we're charged with interpreting.
So that the intent of that zoning section does not,
Well, I think it helps if something was ambiguous and we were looking for intent and it was right in front of us in the preamble, that would be a nice tool to have. But we're not interpreting the preamble, we're interpreting the statute.
okay.
And then the other part that's troubling about that, Ms. Willow, is when you look at the language, it seems to be based upon residential development, which I think this clearly is not. And I grant you that it is odd that the preamble is based on that, but then the statute goes on to talk about a lot of uses other than residential uses. But it's the statute that's controlling, not the preamble, unless it's ambiguous and it talks about what the intent of the drafters were, and then we could certainly use that. But the law requires strict construction in favor of the property owner.
Well, your counsel's invaluable, because we don't know these things. We deal with setbacks for the most part. I want my fence closer to the line, I want my shed closer to the line. This is a lot deeper. And I don't think I've ever read this code book so much as I have in the past week. And I read it over and over and over. But your insights about what the law allows is important.
I'm gonna read.
This is a legal issue now.
Yeah, it is. It is. And so let me read from a secondary source that is a source of authority in zoning issues. It indicates zoning ordinances fall within the class of enactments which are peculiarly difficult to draft. They restrict the use of land, an area of conduct which was notably free of restraint prior to the enactment of the zoning regulation. Their major impact is upon rights in land which enjoy the highest degree of protection under the common law and the federal and state constitutions. Strict construction of such ordinances must be anticipated. Regulations which restrict the use of land must be drafted with special care in the selection of language and meticulous attention to the definition of terms. Absent such careful draftsmanship, the objectives of zoning ordinance may be lost in the process of strict construction. The Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in the state, has held that zoning regulations are in derogation of the common law and must be strictly construed in favor of the property owner. Now, I'm not saying that because I have any belief one way or the other, but it's hard to work around the large lot language when it says agricultural uses are permitted use, and it includes greenhouses and the growing of vegetables. That's difficult to work around. I also struggle with the language in, was it 73? Because I know one of the residents that called in about the use of the word "of" in 22573D. But again, plain reading, it appears as though this subdivision D is addressing single dwelling units. All zoning provisions and restrictions as to single dwelling units of our residential district R3 shall apply. So, again, it appears as to be maybe an oversimplification, but the fact is there are no proposed single-family dwellings in this application. So how is it that we get into that section?
Well, the whole section deals with dimensional requirements, more or less, establishing 5 acres, a lot width of 250 feet, making a determination of, what a front setback is or a side setback is. And then you get to see, they deal with, labor, farm labor and hands and family that's engaged in working the farm and establishing housing for them on the property. And the very next section establishes, there again, my opinion, as I stated before, that there will be some land that is associated with any single-family homes that were built on the farm. My personal feeling is the intent was that if there was a situation like that, it would be done aesthetically pleasing rather than have little shanties for migrant workers.
That's the way I saw it. When I first read it, that's the way I interpreted it.
There again, it's just my interpretation. I mean, even you get down to D, any farm buildings used for residential purposes. The whole thing deals in trying to establish dimensional requirements more or less for migrant workers, or farm labor.
See, and I read it differently, because, I just like to argue.
No problem.
That A, B, and C are defining setbacks and the size of lot if I do put a residence on there for any of the workers of the farm. And anywhere, anything that is not defined by A, B, and C, those provisions apply from the single dwelling unit section of R3. So when I go to R3, it says dimensional regulations as follows. All right, it's already defined the lot size, so that wouldn't count, non-residential 2 acres, so I don't use that. But then I go to number 2, and for R3, the maximum lot coverage is 20%. The minimum lot is 100 feet, well, yes, but it's larger for the agricultural use. It says it has to be at least 200 feet. So where it's not specified here, then it falls back to what's listed in R3. And if I went back and, I don't have R2 in front of me, but, so what it's saying is anything that's not defined, R3 applies. And that's where I think we can't discount the lot coverage. Even as an is an agricultural use, which is allowed, you still have to have some restriction.
Okay.
Otherwise, pave the whole thing.
I don't want to keep hopping back and forth here, but we've gone from the use and what's customary agricultural back to the R3 designation in section D. I'm still looking at the large lot, sorry, I'm not keeping up.
It's okay.
I'm still looking at the large lot residential agricultural uses, and there's been an assertion that agricultural uses aren't defined or aren't well defined, but then we've got 22573 section F where it says customary agricultural operations or farming may be conducted in all zones. So I don't know if we can take section F and say that that is a definition of agricultural uses in 22512 section 6. I'm trying to understand because, by a strict flow chart of this whole thing, if you can take it one way and say, okay, agricultural uses are never defined, and so therefore agricultural uses include greenhouses and we're building greenhouses, but then you get to section F, and I see nothing in 22512 that excludes section F. It's not as though it's just part of, well, if you're in an R3 zone, then section F applies. It says conducted in all zones. So does section F apply to all zones, which means large lot residential, and then we're back to what's customary?
Yeah.
Is that a question you're asking of me or?
Well, it's a point of discussion that I'd like to hear other people's opinions on, because, we've heard.
Well, I guess what carries more weight? The definition is written in 225.3, or what's written in is it 225.73F? Because there's a definition of agricultural uses or use in 225.3.
What's it say, Don?
I think we're hung up on the word customary.
Yes, that's the whole thing. I think we all could agree it could have been written better initially.
Yeah, well, as John just read to us, that the codes need to be written carefully so we don't have these issues. So, but this was written way after the large lot zoning was established. So I think this was not meant to alter, this is my opinion.
When you say that, you're referring to 73.
Yeah. Yeah, it was written long after it, so this wasn't meant to alter the previous code. I think this was meant to amend and add more uses to more zones. You follow my logic? It doesn't specifically say this changes what we, what was previously allowed in the other residential zones. This went to allow farming and industrial and commercial.
But
Well,
does it
if
give more
that was
tightened
the
definition?
intent, but there's no particular preamble to this.
It doesn't
and
tell you
so
that.
I could look at it as saying, okay, well, we've got this definition up there, you know, in 225.3, now we're going to elaborate on it a little bit more. You know, and so, I mean, again, it becomes a matter of interpretation.
Correct.
So,
You were gonna say something as well?
Well, because Article 9 was added to the code after the R3 and the large lot definitions were added to the code, I look at that as being a more precise definition or a more restrictive definition.
You know, more
This-
evolved.
Yes, here's what I initially put in the code, and then here's my refinement of it. So I've given more definition and more interpretation than originally, and so this applies to all districts, based on whether you're doing a kennel or a bed and breakfast or an agricultural use or whatever section it applies.
and Barry, to your point, if you read the 225.3 definition of agricultural use, it goes through use of land, buildings, you know, greenhouse products, but then at the end of that definition, in parentheses, it says see section 225-73, which would cause me to think, okay, we're going to now look at 225.73 for a more elaborate definition here that's been added after the fact. So, in fact, I think that F applies.
And to me, because it says C section 223, I interpret that as being included in the definition now. Here's added information that now goes in the
Why wouldn't the
definition.
drafters, if that was their intent, placed the word customary in the most significant part of the code, where agricultural use would apply?
Because they just intended 225.73 as a footnote to that, to, okay, if you're going to look at the definition of agricultural use, also go back and see this. We're not going to bring it all and rewrite that statement.
It's the same, in bed and breakfast, it does something similar, where it says it meets the requirements of section 225.69, which is also a section of the Article 9. So it pulls that further definition in without repeating it in two different places.
Which is actually ISO 90,000.
Yeah,
You
because-
don't want to repeat the same thing over and over again because you might miss it.
Right, when you
When you
edit
go
one,
back
you miss
and edit
something.
one, you miss something else. That's why we don't have our drawings out on the website and also in the design engineering folder, because every time it means we've got to go out and edit multiple places.
Well,
Do you have a time frame when customary was added to 225-73?
It appears to be around 2010.
Around 2010. So prior to that, I would argue that agricultural projects, there wasn't a need for customary, because agricultural projects for 4 or 5 generations were a tractor, a barn, a plow, things that grew in the soil. I mean, for agriculture was agricultural, farming was farming. I mean, it wasn't until recently, I would say 2010 would be a good time frame, where there had to be a distinction between what a farm was and what a farm was becoming.
Yeah, because you
I can tell you with 100% certainty that the framework of what a farm was, the people that defined what a farm was or agricultural was, never imagined what I see those greenhouses north of 104. Never considered that as an option. I asked Don about a definition of a greenhouse for a reason. I mean, forever. I mean, our lifetime. we saw a greenhouse, we knew a greenhouse had the same dimensions, and pretty much what you see on Whiting Road is what you saw in greenhouses.
Typical greenhouse.
Yeah.
So 2010, 10 years later, I mean, when was that constructed? 3 years ago? 2016, 2017?
What was constructed?
2017, 18.
On 104?
On 104 by the windmills.
In a row.
Okay? I can tell you that the people who, at the time that this was written, a farm was a farm. Agriculture was agricultural. They never envisioned or even considered the prospect of a project like that 104 project. Now, is that why they put customary into the equation? I don't know. I didn't write this, but that might be a reason why.
Well, to an extent too, the whole thing with communications towers was added into the code after a fairly large brouhaha over the idea of putting a 300-foot cell phone tower down at the sewer treatment plant, which...
Actually, it was the highway department.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was, that meeting lasted till 4 in the morning, and essentially got turned down by the zoning board because it was, well, I'd have to even review the minutes, even though I did the regression analysis on their home property, the claims that it wasn't going to impact the property values. But then at that point, the town board started to try and get out in front of these things more aggressively, proactively. And so at that point, they looked at the agricultural use, and all of a sudden you've got factory farming of chickens, factory farming of hogs, very, very large dairy barns that would almost cover the whole town complex. And they said, no, this is not a customary agricultural use.
I think I'd look at this a little different if there was a farm, and you built a house, and then you complained about the stink of, because the farmer was tilling fertilizer, because that farm was there and you built your house. Farming, they've always done that. In this case here, they built their houses, and now they're bringing in a development that arguably, you got to argue the definition of what they're calling it agricultural. For the true sense of the word, they might be right, they might be wrong.
Well,
Because there's no soil. Hydroponics is there's no tilling of the land. They're building an enclosure for it. It's year round, which I don't think would be custom.
Well, and not even
definition
tilling the
of
land,
so farming, right, year round.
the nutritional topsoil that is the value of the farm is going to be stripped away and removed from the site, and then there's going to be concrete and pavement put over it.
But I think the board's getting way far afield here, right? So we're not before the planning board, right? Agricultural use is defined in 225. It's not ambiguous. It says greenhouses.
Yes, but then it also
Just
says
greenhouse
C
products.
225-73.
That we're going to get to that. All right. Now, when you go to 73, so we all agree there's no ambiguity with greenhouses in the definition at 225-3. Is there any debate on that issue?
No.
Okay. Well, let's go to the next section, which is 225-73. So the first thing here is that the board would have to believe that this 22573 is additional wording to define agricultural use.
Well, when it says see that section.
Let me finish that, but that's not the statute, okay? It says, customary agricultural operations or farming may be conducted in all zones. So the last part, may be conducted in all zones. That doesn't have much to do with the definition of agricultural use. That's a qualifier, right? Talks about this type of operation, that being a customary type, can be conducted in all zones. That's entirely different than an expansion of the definition. It's a qualifier of where other agricultural operations that are customary can be conducted. So, my advice to the board is think carefully about 22573 before you determine that that is really an expansion of the definition in 225.3. Because if it were to be, I don't know why it would say conducted in all zones. That suggests to me that it's not.
That would suggest to me that it means that this definition or modifier to 225.3's definition applies to large lot R3, R1, R2, the whole kit and caboodle.
Why would it need to say that, though? For what purpose? Wherever agricultural use is used, you have the definition right here. No other definition says that, boarding of horses is applicable wherever you can board horses. There's a reason why that's there.
I think one of the things, most of us are lifelong residents of town. And a lot of times we let our personal opinions get in the way of what we're trying to decide because that's human beings, that's what we do. But what we have here is a legal issue in front of us. And if we don't make the right decision from a legal standpoint, it's going to be challenged yet again. So, in other words, we have to put our personal preferences aside, read the code for what it is, and try to be objective. And that's tough to do. That's tough to do because we all have our own personal biases, but we got to do our best to be objective.
But that's why I brought up Occam's razor. If you take the absolute simplest, then it basically says agricultural use includes greenhouses. This is a greenhouse. It's permitted in a large lot zone. And
it's not, though, if you take the simplest, though. The requirement is that you have to strictly construe the words that are there.
Well,
not a question of simple, but a question of strict construction.
Okay. I guess I would interpret simple as being strict construction.
Okay, well, yeah, that's your definition.
You're not adding anything to those words,
right.
so it's...
Now, the law gives you the right to do that if it's ambiguous. Then we start getting into intent and interpretation.
Right.
But we're charged with strict interpretation if it's clear. That's why I said it's a difficult argument when you're in the large lot and it says agricultural uses. Agricultural uses is defined as greenhouses. They take the extra step. I think the attorneys for the company include the letter from the Agricultural and Markets from the state of New York. It talks about this company anticipating the construction of 7 greenhouses. The Agriculture and Markets Law defines farm operations as the land and on-farm buildings, equipment, processing, handling facilities, and practices which contribute to the production, preparation, and marketing of crops. I think, I don't think there's a lot of ambiguity in that portion. I think the closer call of ambiguity and grayness is the second part of the equation, which is the R3 language.
I would agree with that.
And that's so ambiguous that it's very difficult to figure out.
Well, I think we have some differences in opinion, which is good.
No, I mean,
the
I take no exception to somebody else's opinion. I'm just looking the way that was written. I wish it was clearer. I think all board members and training staff wish it was clearer too, but unfortunately, nothing's black and white.
So, state again, you feel that it applies to the residential units or the entire code for R3? What's your thought?
My opinion, I think it's was to the residential units, because
It has to do with the residence itself, but not,
for the tenants, farm labor. So because they wanted to make sure that if there were any homes that were constructed for labor, they were aesthetically pleasing. And that's why they wanted to establish setbacks for those homes from the road right away.
that's the way I read it initially. And then I started to second guess myself.
Well, you can.
Yeah. But,
I mean, you could look at it from both ways. I mean, Ms. Volo's way also. I mean, if
Yeah.
it's not there, then you go there and you go to R3 zone and utilize what dimensional requirements for within the R3.
So what you're saying, let me see if I can paraphrase a little bit, is you've got all of these definitions or discussion in C that you can build additional residences on a single tax code lot, that being the farm, and that's allowed, but they can never be split off, and beyond that, those residences have to conform to the R3 district.
That area, yeah.
Which is what D basically says is, okay, we're gonna make some exceptions in C.
Right.
And then D basically brings all of R3 into that for those residences, which, to Ms. Volo's point, you'd almost wish that they had said, okay,
Comply with R3 requirements.
Section A.
Yeah.
well, that says that they can be sold off, but they have to be minimum 5-acre lots.
Right.
So that maintains the integrity of the farms. In other words, you might have one farm that's 100 acres, but if you build the houses far enough apart, you might someday have 5 smaller farms.
Which is against R3 zoning altogether, because, well, I believe back when this was written, R3 zoning required 18,000 square feet, now it's 22,000 square feet. Who's on first, who's on second?
Yeah. Yeah, when they wanted to reduce the density of the town, they upped all the square footages of the lots.
Said another way, whether or not D expands beyond single-family dwellings.
Mhm.
Right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And again, there, strict construction, they could be argued is apparent on its face. But, clearly an argument could be made that it's not. So, is it ambiguous or isn't it?
That's what you're for.
Well, that's an interesting, I'm clearly not a voter, and I'm not here to influence votes. I'm here to make sure that as you discuss this, that you're discussing it within the framework that you're legally supposed to be.
Right.
So if it sounds as though I've got a dog in the fight or I'm leaning one way or the other, please don't interpret it as
I'm
that.
listening to what you say, and the way you're phrasing it, I understand exactly what you're trying to convey to this board. I understand it. I mean, but at the same time, you're not giving us an answer.
Because that's not my job.
That I think we're looking for, because maybe there isn't one. I mean,
Well, we're gonna have to make a decision one way or the other.
I know.
I think Mr. DeMarco's purpose here is to keep us on track, give us the legal perspective as to what, because it's a legal issue, it's not a variance, they're not asking for a variance, it's a legal, determination as to whether or not this is an allowed use and the lot coverage is acceptable, that's what they're looking for. And he's just, like he said, we're not the planning board, he's trying to keep us in bounds here to focus on what we need to decide.
So if we determined that this was not allowable,
Not an allowed use, is that what you're saying?
allowable use, two things could happen, right? We could have legal action against us, or the town board would actually have to add another provision to what is used and clarify something that is not customary farming or agriculture.
Well,
And I don't even know what you call it, because
We're charged with making a determination as the law currently stands tonight with the application that's before us. Although it may be interesting to discuss what happens if we decide one way or the other, it is really of no moment.
We have no idea what the town board would do.
hypothetical.
We have to focus on what we have to do.
No.
And our job is big enough. All right.
We have to make sure our decision isn't arbitrary, capricious, that it's based upon facts that are in the record.
Has everybody had enough for tonight?
I think so.
Okay, so I guess what we do is, obviously, we all need time to think and reflect on what we've heard. What we do is just table further discussion, and public portion of the meeting is closed. So further discussion will be amongst board members anyways. So everybody, you got 2 weeks to think about it.
Let me just admonish everybody a little bit. Well, first and foremost, before I do that, the public hearing is closed, proofs are closed. This now lies in the board's hands only. And it's important that, there not be any subgroups or discussions with each other until you all reassemble here and we're in the public and open meeting posture. I would also say that in fairness to both of the parties, our decision should be made based upon what is in the record, the papers that we've received. It would be unfair to either party to interact with other interested parties that didn't present or speak at this meeting. Similar to what we would ask of a jury is to decide the case based upon what we have here in this room and the controlling statutes. Because I think the temptation would be to solicit other opinions or listen to neighbors that drops things off at your front porch, etc. And we shouldn't be doing that. And if we were to do that, I think it would then only be fair to open the hearing back up to the parties and the public.
Understood?
Understood?
Agreed.
All right, so, I made a motion to table this discussion until the next
Second.
meeting. Do I have a second? Second.
I didn't hear anybody else say it.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye. So with respect to the agenda, right now we have an agenda, correct? For the 23rd.
23rd.
Okay. So in the event that any of the parties want to be here, what makes the most sense? To put this at the beginning of the short agenda?
Beginning.
Pardon?
I would say beginning.
The beginning?
Sure. It's just a continuation of this meeting. That's my opinion.
Okay.
I don't have a problem with that.
So with that, I don't know, with respect to staff, does that mean you calendar the other matters for 8 o'clock, or how are you?
And then there is a significant break until the next meeting at the end of July. So, I mean, we can reach out to applicants and see if we can rearrange some things.
Well, could I suggest that we do have, I don't want to take 60 days, I don't want this on my mind for 60 days. But we could start to deal with it first thing next meeting, and if it seems like it's going to go on and on and on, we could table it again if we have to. Why don't we do that? And, you know, maybe our ideas will kind of come together by the next meeting, we'll see. After we, I don't know, what do you think, John? You think that makes sense?
I know one of the matters that is on for the next meeting is going to be
Contentious. Yeah.
and lengthy, so, and you've got, what, 2 or 3 matters in addition to that? All right, so you're talking about not getting to this matter, or not getting to those other matters. You're gonna have to figure at least a couple hours.
Would we have 2 tabled items from
We have
this
two
agenda?
from the previous agenda.
One Ridge Road.
Ridge Road and the car wash use variance, which we have extra material where we need to get in order to hear the use variance.
Can I,
Oh, go ahead.
this may be way out of bounds and of no interest to the board, but what would the possibility be if we picked a date next week other than a scheduled date to handle this matter exclusively? Does anyone have any interest in that?
I don't think we can do that without publishing it
We
appropriately.
can't do it.
Right.
Like I said, it may have been way out of bounds.
Actually,
Advertise was open.
just scheduling would be difficult.
It would have
And
to be
advertising.
published and noticed.
Yeah, they have to publish. Notice there. Okay, well. That, you know
Bring
what?
pajamas tonight.
This isn't the place to discuss that right now. We'll check with Karen and see when things could be done. Maybe we could pick up another interim meeting. That might be the way to go. That might be the way. Good suggestion. I want to thank everybody. Thanks, especially John for all his legal counsel. Thank you for the applicants and their presentations, and thank everybody for their patience. And you all have a good evening, and we'll see you on the 23rd, right? 23rd.